One night in the spring of 1984, a woman living in Florida was suddenly startled awake by a blood-curdling scream. She sat there wondering what she should do, but after hearing silence outside, she told herself that the scream was probably nothing, maybe a cat or something, and then she went back to sleep. However, this woman would later find out that more than a dozen of her neighbors had also heard that terrible piercing scream, but just like her, they had all decided to do nothing. This decision would end up haunting the citizens of Gulfport, Florida for years to come because that scream was the last desperate cry for help from a person who was about to be murdered. This story includes sexual content and some graphic violence. As such, listener discretion is advised. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week. Once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please go into the Amazon Music Follow Buttons refrigerator and ever so slightly uncap all of their beer bottles so they all go flat. Okay, let's get into today's story. "36-year-old Karen Gregory had always been a free spirit. From the time she was born in upstate New York back in 1948, Karen would become known among her family and friends as a person who challenged the conventional way of doing things. By the time Karen was enrolled in her local parochial high school, she was making her three younger siblings double over with laughter with inspired imitations of the elderly nuns who ruled their classrooms with iron fists. When it came time to go to college, Karen convinced her parents to let her leave their small hometown and go to a college in Rochester, a city in western New York. And when it came time to graduate from that college, an especially proud moment for Karen's very elderly grandmother, Karen made a point of ignoring the school's strict dress code. Instead of wearing stockings and heels under her gown when she received her degree in art education, Karen clomped across the stage wearing massive hiking boots. When her grandmother in the crowd noticed them, she let out a gasp that was so loud that for a moment, the entire ceremony came to a halt. And after college, Karen leaned hard into the hippie movement of the 1960s. After Karen left home for good, her parents were horrified to pick up the newspaper one day and find a picture of their daughter's familiar smiling face peering out at them from the middle of a group of Vietnam War protesters. And even after the 1960s gave way to the less radical 1970s, Karen's choice of marriage and careers were no less shocking to her very conservative parents. When Karen got married in 1971, at the age of 23, she skipped the traditional Catholic wedding service, opting instead for a small ceremony that was not attended by any of her family members, and then she settled down in Fitzwilliam, a tiny and isolated town in New Hampshire. There, Karen found a job teaching art to elementary school children, and she also got another job helping to care for the mentally ill. When she was home with her husband, Karen would tend to the couple's sprawling garden and make their vegetarian meals completely from scratch. But if Karen's style of marriage and careers were not exactly in line with what her parents had hoped for, her divorce a few years later was even more of a shock. Karen's family believed her marriage was solid. But according to Karen, she and her husband just kind of drifted apart and now just wanted to be friends. Then, after the divorce was finalized, Karen did not change her last name back to her maiden name, which was Marshall. Instead, she announced that she was formally changing her last name to her mother's maiden name, Gregory. And then, when love knocked again at Karen's door after her divorce, this time Karen just avoided marriage and moved in with her new boyfriend, who was a potter, someone who makes pottery. And before long, Karen had also learned the craft of throwing clay on the potter's wheel while living in a big and drafty house and adopting a collection of stray cats. And through each of Karen's rebellions, her two younger brothers and her younger sister were always there to support her. They loved their sister. She was the family trailblazer. Her independence and sense of humor and ability to tell wonderful stories had made all of their own passages to adulthood that much easier. Even Karen's mother, Sophia, who had fought so hard with Karen over some of her daughter's life choices, found herself reaching out to Karen when Sophia's own marriage to Karen's father ended in divorce. But it wasn't until January of 1983 that Karen, without any prompting at all from her family, suddenly decided to make her most radical lifestyle change yet. After spending her whole life, 35 years, in the cold northeast of the United States, living in the center of tightly knit towns and communities where like-minded people shared everything from tomato seeds to granola recipes, Karen made a complete about-face. She was simply done with the cold, with the garden, with the cats, and with the Potter boyfriend. And so just when winter was hitting its stride in New Hampshire in January of 1983, Karen packed up her Volkswagen and headed south to Florida to start a brand new life. She had decided to join her sister, Kim, who was married and working as a nurse, in Pinellas County, a peninsula of land that hangs like a fishhook off the central west coast of Florida. While Kim and her husband had made their home in the northern tip of the peninsula, Karen drove right down to the bottom of the fishhook. And within a few months, Karen was living in an apartment she shared with a roommate in the historic Florida beach town of Paso Grill. Picking up a waitressing job in nearby St. Petersburg, Karen luxuriated in the winter heat of her new home and spent hours of her spare time biking along the beautiful white sand Florida beaches. Pinellas County was bigger, sunnier, and in places far more developed and paved over than anywhere else Karen had ever lived. But it didn't take long for her to make plenty of new friends, to cut her hair, and to dress in more stylish local attire. Karen's olive skin quickly picked up a deep tan that set off her dark brown hair and arresting blue eyes. Already fit and strong, the walking and biking added even more tone to her slender 5'5" frame. And Karen soon became an expert at turning away the unwanted attention of patrons at The Garden, the popular restaurant bar in St. Petersburg where she worked. But in March, 3 months after Karen arrived in Paso Grill, Karen met the man who would become the love of her life. The administrator of a counseling program for Vietnam veterans, David Mackey, was strikingly handsome and well-educated, and in a state where so many residents were transplants like Karen, David was a native Floridian and longtime resident of the nearby town of Gulfport, located just 9 miles to the northeast of Paso Grill. And this time, it was Karen who was the one asking for a first date, not her would-be suitor, David. In 1984, interracial relationships were just not as common and socially acceptable as they are today. It was just a different time. And Karen was Caucasian and David was African American. Additionally, David was 7 years younger than Karen. He was 29. But neither of those facts made the slightest difference to Karen, or, as it would turn out, to David. And before long, David and Karen were a certified couple. And together they went sailing, they went to movies, and to concerts that featured the popular Jamaican-style reggae music they both loved. In March of 1984, so 1 year after Karen and David had met, David threw a surprise party for Karen on her 36th birthday. And it was clear to all of the partygoers that these two were deeply in love and practically living together in David's house in Gulfport. After that, things in Karen's life moved quickly. In May of that same year, just 2 months after Karen's surprise birthday party, Karen landed a good job as a graphic artist with a St. Petersburg company called Datacom that produced technical drawings and illustrations. And around that same time, she and David decided to make their relationship more formal. Instead of just meeting up every night to spend time together, the couple decided Karen would move out of her apartment in Paso Grill and live full-time with David in his modest but very comfortable home in Gulfport. Although Karen was excited about this upcoming move, David's quiet neighborhood, a few blocks away from the water, would be a big change from the beachfront charm and laid-back vibes of Paso Grill. David's 3-bedroom house, with its glassed-in front porch, sat right on a corner lot. There was a big oak tree that sat on one side of the property that shaded half of the single-story white home, leaving the other half of the building to bake in the sun. Although the couple who lived across the street from David were young and lived in Gulfport year-round, many of David and Karen's other neighbors were older, and some were retirees who only lived in Florida during the winter months. And while David had always felt welcome in Gulfport, He and Karen could both sense that as an interracial couple, they drew the occasional disapproving look or stare. But overall, one look around the neighborhood was enough to tell anyone passing through its tree-lined streets that what residents here really seemed to value the most was their sense of safety and tranquility. Because peppered throughout her new community, Karen had seen the same sign posted in conspicuous places on many lawns. In big letters, the signs read, "Warning, this is a Citizens Crime Watch area." And even if all those warnings seemed a little alarmist, given how sleepy the neighborhood was, Karen was okay with it. To her, Pinellas County was this huge metropolis compared to where she had moved from, Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire, and so she was naturally a little more paranoid about her safety. To celebrate all the good fortune in Karen's life, Karen and her sister Kim arranged a family day at the beach. And so on May 19th, Karen and David spent the day with Kim and her husband and their daughter. It was a perfect spring day in central Florida, the hot air cooled by a breeze off the ocean, and a few clouds offered intervals of shade from the bright sun. And the adults had plenty to talk about, especially Karen and Kim. Karen was nearly fully moved in to David's house, she was happy about her new job, and she and Kim were both excited at the prospect of their mother, Sophia, potentially moving out to Florida as well. On the following Monday, Karen said that David was leaving for a work conference in Rhode Island that would last most of the week. After living with a roommate in Paso Grill or staying over at David's house, Karen was a bit out of practice when it came to spending nights alone. But in spite of being a little nervous at the prospect of doing just that, Karen told Kim that she'd use the time to finish moving and unpacking. And on the upcoming Tuesday night, May 23rd, Karen said she had made plans to have dinner with her good girlfriend, Naverne Covington. Not only would that dinner be a chance for the friends to spend a fun evening together, but also Naverne would be leaving the next day to attend a wedding, and Karen needed instructions on feeding Naverne's cat and watering Naverne's plants while she was away. And by the time Tuesday night did roll around, Karen was glad for the dinner date she had made with Naverne. After switching out of her work clothes into a sleeveless white t-shirt and baggy green shorts and tennis shoes, Karen headed to Paso Grill to make a few trips from her apartment to David's house with the last of her belongings. And at about 7:30 p.m., with the final box of her plants safely stowed in the back of her Volkswagen, she decided to go straight from Paso Grill to Naverne's house in Gulfport. A few hours later, as Karen left Naverne's house not long after midnight, Karen smiled. The evening could not have gone any better, and after all the changes of the last several weeks, dinner with her close friend was exactly what Karen had needed. The two women had laughed and talked over their glasses of white wine and plates of vegetable stew that had filled Naverne's cozy kitchen with the smell of herbs and garlic. And when the two friends said goodnight, Karen had surprised Naverne by pausing at the door and giving Naverne a quick, tight hug. Even though Naverne laughed and told Karen, "I'm only going to be gone for a couple of days," Karen had suddenly wanted Naverne to know that Karen would miss her. Walking to her car and sliding into the driver's seat, Karen smiled again. She would now head back to the little house she shared with David, and she'd bring in her last few boxes of plants, and when David called the next day to check in, Karen wouldn't even tell him about how much progress she'd made unpacking and blending their furnishings and belongings together. Instead, she wanted him to be surprised when he returned from his trip. A few minutes later, Karen pulled her little car into the driveway of 27th Avenue South and Upton Street. After parking her car next to David's car, he had left it behind for this business trip, Karen opened her door and climbed outside. After collecting her last few boxes of things from the trunk, Karen headed inside and locked the door behind her. Even though it was well past midnight, Karen wasn't quite ready to go straight to bed. She had been having trouble sleeping the last few nights, and so she decided she would just sit down and relax for a little while. Less than 1 hour later, a blood-curdling scream ripped through David and Karen's quiet neighborhood. Hearing it, several of Karen and David's neighbors sat bolt upright in their beds, wondering what was going on. One woman told herself that it must have been a cat or some other animal. Another woman remembered thinking that whoever had screamed had really strong lungs. And another woman pulled her husband back inside when he stepped out onto their front step to investigate. 1.5 days later, a woman named Amy Bressler was standing at her living room window talking to someone on the phone and looking out at David Mackey's house. At one point, she told the caller, "Yes, I can see Karen's car in the driveway." A minute later, Amy put the phone receiver down on the table, left her house, and walked across the road to knock on the side door of David's house. When she didn't get an answer, she walked around to the front door. There too, Amy's knock also went unanswered. But not before Amy noticed that some of the window panes in the front porch door had been broken. Walking again back toward the back of the house, Amy noticed curtains moving in one of the bedroom windows. When she stopped to look more closely, she saw that the reason they were moving is because the window was wide open. Amy reached through the open window and pushed the curtains aside and looked into David's house. A minute later, crying hysterically, Amy had stumbled back inside of her own house. Reaching for the phone she had left on the table, she could picture David Mackey at the other end of the line, stuck at his work conference in Rhode Island and frantic with worry after all his calls to Karen during the last 30 hours had gone unanswered. But before David could even ask his neighbor if Karen was okay, all Amy could manage to tell him, in a voice choked with tears, was, "David, it's something horrible. I need to get the police." A few minutes later, at 8:39 a.m., 22-year-old Gulfport police officer Cheryl Falkenstein was climbing through that open bedroom window on the side of David's single-story house. Even if she had been on the police force for 5 years instead of just 5 months, the young officer would not have been prepared for what she saw in the hallway just beyond the bedroom. When Amy's 911 call had come into the station a few minutes earlier, the dispatcher had told Officer Falkenstein and emergency medical personnel that they were responding to a report of a non-responsive person. But in fact, it was instantly clear to Officer Falkenstein that this person was not just non-responsive, they were dead. It was also instantly clear that the deceased, Karen Gregory, had been the victim of a gruesome and violent attack. And not only that, but from the small lake of dried blood that surrounded Karen's half-naked body, the stiffness of her limbs, and the smell of decomposition, she had obviously been lying undiscovered in this hallway for some time, first injured, and then, when no help came, dead. Within minutes of Officer Falkenstein reporting the murder, yellow crime scene tape surrounded David's corner property, and the quiet neighborhood of Gulfport was crowded with law enforcement and medical personnel. The last time the tiny Gulfport Police Department had processed a major murder scene had been 23 years earlier. And so the Pinellas County medical examiner, who was among the first to arrive on the scene, immediately told local police that she was going to ask the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to help out with the investigation, because it was already clear from the doctor's preliminary examination of Karen's body that this could shape up to be a very difficult case. Dr. Joan Wood did not need to do a complete autopsy to see that Karen had been dead long enough for rigor mortis to set in and for the blood on her body and throughout the small house to dry. This also meant that any physical evidence left on or inside of Karen's body would likely have degraded during the time that Karen had gone undiscovered. So, even though police could clearly see bloody handprints on Karen's body and on the bedroom windowsill, those prints might or might not prove useful as evidence. Compared to the large staff from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, Gulfport only had 3 detectives, and all of them had arrived at the crime scene shortly after the 911 call to dispatch. By then, the first patrol officers on site had already begun to interview Karen and David's neighbors, contact Karen's family, and contact Karen's boyfriend, David, who was already arranging air travel to get from his conference in Rhode Island back to Florida. Reached by phone in Rhode Island, David told police that he had spent most of the day on Wednesday, May 23rd, the day after Karen's dinner with Naverne, reaching out to Karen's friends, family, and employers, as well as local hospitals and police departments to try to figure out where Karen was and why she wasn't answering his calls. But it was only when he finally called his neighbor, Amy, who lived up the street from David, and asked her to please go check his house to see if Karen was okay, that David got his answer. Meanwhile, it hadn't taken local police long to realize that at least a dozen of David's neighbors had heard what police now assumed was Karen's scream for help at about 1:15 a.m. in the early morning hours of May 23rd. Even though they described this scream as being short, high-pitched, and agonizing, and so distressing that several neighbors had trouble falling back to sleep after hearing it, no one in the Crime Watch neighborhood of Gulfport had bothered to pick up their phones and call the police. By late afternoon on May 24th, more than 30 hours after that scream, Gulfport investigators had already reached several conclusions about the murder of Karen Gregory. Given the report of a scream at 1:15 a.m. on May 23rd, police assumed the time of death was also during the early morning hours of May 23rd. Since there was no sign of forced entry and items of any obvious value were still inside the house, this did not look like a crime that started as a break-in or robbery. What was clear was that even though Karen must have willingly opened the door to her attacker, she had later used every ounce of her strength to try to fight off that attacker. Because from one end of the house to the other, Karen had left a trail of blood, from stains on the unmade bed in the bedroom, where Karen's faded green shorts and tennis shoes lay scattered on the floor, to the blood spatter along the walls of the hallway and living room, right up to the smeared and stained bedroom windowsill and curtains that marked where the killer had exited the house after the attack. And Karen's willingness to fight back and cry out for help could have saved her life if anyone who heard her had called the police. Because, at some point in the struggle, it looked to investigators like Karen had almost escaped from her attacker. After finding more blood and strands of Karen's hair on the glass inside the front porch, investigators theorized that at one point Karen had made it through the inner front porch all the way to that porch door where the screen was covered by angled slats of glass rather than solid wood. And it was probably there, as Karen had reached that outer door and opened it up, that she had let out that terrible scream. However, seconds later, her attacker had reached her again and yanked her back inside of the house, knocking most likely Karen's head against the door slats, causing them to shatter and leave glass fragments outside on the front walkway. And then shortly after Karen was pulled back inside of the house, the killer finished her off. Police also assumed that Karen's attacker had forced her to wear the black lace lingerie that was pulled on over her white t-shirt and was now bunched up at Karen's waist. Aside from the brutality of the murder, two things about the crime scene stood out to detectives as potentially important pieces of physical evidence. Since there was no blood on Karen's bare feet, that meant that the bare footprints left in the blood-soaked carpet and the smudge of a heel print left on the bathroom tile just off the hallway where Karen was found must have both been left by her killer. And as the crime scene techs would later confirm, the handprints on Karen's naked thigh and lower back were positioned in such a way that they could not have been made by Karen. So, like the footprints, the handprints also had to belong to Karen's attacker. Investigators got their first break in the case when one of the Gulfport officers doing door-to-door interviews realized that the neighbor who lived across the street from David's house was another public safety officer, St. Petersburg firefighter George Lewis. Although George was at work when Karen's body was discovered that morning, when contacted by phone, George immediately reported to the Gulfport police station and wrote out a 2-page statement. That statement contained all the information he could recall, at least right then, from the morning of and the days before Karen's murder. It turned out that George, in addition to being a firefighter, was also the unofficial head of the neighborhood crime watch. And he was also the only person in the neighborhood who had actually kind of reacted to the sound of that scream. To George, who had been inside of his garage working on his motorcycle with the radio turned on, the scream had actually sounded faint. And when he stepped outside and did not hear or see anything suspicious, he had assumed all was well before going back inside of his house and reassuring his girlfriend, who had also heard the scream, that everything seemed okay. At that point, the couple had just gone to bed, and then for the next day and a half, like everyone else in the neighborhood, they had just gone about their daily lives as normal. George had known David and Karen by sight, but he had not met Karen and he had not seen her at any point on the day before she was killed. Even though George was not able to shed any light on circumstances surrounding the actual murder, the 22-year-old firefighter was able to give police some solid leads on possible suspects. One was a man who mowed the grass at David's house on Tuesday morning, the last day Karen was alive. The second tip helped explain a note that police had found shortly after discovering Karen's body that had been left under the windshield wiper of David's car. Whoever had left the note had signed it Peter. At about 7 p.m. on May 23rd, the evening after the murder, George had seen a man drive up to David's house in a van, get out of the van, and walk up the front sidewalk to David's house where he knocked on the front porch door. When no one answered, the man went back to his van and a moment later emerged with a note that he left on David's car before driving away. By late that evening, hours after George had given his written statement to police, local investigators were close to crossing the man who had mowed David's lawn off of the suspect list. In addition to providing police with his fingerprints and a DNA sample, the man could also confirm that he had a solid alibi for the night of Karen's murder. The same would be true when police had a chance to finally interview David Mackey, who reported to the police station as soon as he arrived back in Gulfport late on the day that Karen's body was discovered. David had been in Rhode Island since Monday, and other members of the conference were able to confirm that he had not left the conference for any significant stretch of time. But it was the third possible suspect, the mystery man named Peter, who had left that note on David's car, who the police really wanted to speak to. So, when an officer inside of David's house answered a call from a man looking for Karen, who identified himself as Peter Cumble, the officer grabbed his notebook to take down all of the details. Yes, Peter said, he was a friend of Karen and David's. He had stopped by to see them on May 23rd to give Karen a cassette tape of music, as well as to confirm a dinner date the three of them had planned for later in the week. And yes, when he'd walked to the front door, he had noticed broken glass right outside on the sidewalk. But before detectives could even make plans to interview Peter showed up at the county morgue with Karen's friend and former roommate to make a formal identification of Karen's body. Afterward, Detective Larry Tosi invited Peter to the police station to question him about his movements at the time of Karen's murder and about his visit to Karen and David's house on May 24th. And even after Peter again told police that he really had only stopped by to drop off a cassette tape of music for Karen and to confirm dinner plans with the couple, Peter quickly went from possible suspect to prime suspect. First, there was the note that Peter, the host of a local radio program, had left on David's car. It was the last phrase of the note that raised the hairs on the back of the investigators' necks. "Hello," the note read. "Stopped by about 7:15 or so, but I saw no signs of life." In addition, during Peter's interview, Detective Tosi had noticed a scratch on Peter's hand. And while Peter insisted he'd gotten the scratch while playing with his dog, the investigator had to wonder if maybe Peter had gotten that scratch while struggling with Karen. And even though Peter's roommate said that as far as he knew, Peter had been at their apartment on the night and early morning that Karen was murdered, investigators thought Peter's alibi might be flimsy, especially when David and Karen's former roommate told police that they thought Peter had actually been romantically interested in Karen. If Peter had been jealous or obsessed with Karen, that might be a motive for murder. In addition to Peter Cumble, police had plenty of other leads to follow too. A man Karen had met when she was a waitress in St. Petersburg, who had repeatedly and unsuccessfully asked her to go out on dates, and a coworker from Datacom who had also shown Karen a lot of unwanted attention and whose name was written on the bottom of a piece of blood-stained paper that David had found inside of his house after Karen's murder. By June 1st, when Detective Tosi, the most experienced of the three Gulfport detectives, left Florida for a month-long family vacation, he fully expected that by the time he got back, the Karen Gregory murder case would be solved. But the 13-year veteran of the Gulfport Police Department was wrong. When Detective Tosi had returned at the beginning of July from 4 relaxing weeks in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, not only did the case file look disorganized, but all those promising first leads were starting to look like dead ends. But even after Sergeant Tosi had been assigned to replace the junior detective who had handled the case while Detective Tosi was on vacation, investigators still faced one disappointment after another. The man who had mowed David and Karen's lawn, along with the man who had hounded Karen for dates at work, both passed lie detector tests, and the DNA samples they had given police did not match any prints that crime scene techs had found at David's house. Peter Cumble, the man who had left that note on David's car the evening after her murder, had now hired a lawyer. But, like the other initial suspects in the case, Peter's fingerprints and DNA did not match any of the evidence taken from the crime scene. And the quality and handling of all that physical evidence had also turned out to be a huge problem for local investigators. As far as Detective Tosi was concerned, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement could have and should have done a better job securing and processing the crime scene. The state crime text told local law enforcement that the bloody finger and handprints on Karen's body were too old and degraded by the time Karen's body was discovered for the text to match the prints they had collected against the prints of any possible suspects. The state crime unit said the same was true of the partial footprint they had found on the tile floor of the bathroom that opened out onto the hallway where Karen's body was found. And there had been no going back for a second look at any of that physical evidence. On the same day that Karen's body was discovered and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement processed the scene, when the state crime techs left, they allowed two of Karen and David's friends to completely clean and scrub and vacuum the house. The friends didn't want David to see any sign of the obvious horror that had surrounded Karen in her final minutes of life, but that decision by the state crime unit had also meant that within hours of the assault, all physical evidence of the crime had been literally wiped away. Meanwhile, the autopsy report from the county medical examiner was also disappointing. A closer examination of Karen's body had revealed a wound that had not been immediately visible under all the blood that had covered Karen's face and torso. And the examination had also revealed the presence of semen inside of Karen's body, which confirmed that Karen had likely been sexually assaulted before her murder. But by the time Karen's body had been found, the semen was too old and degraded to provide a useful DNA match to DNA samples collected from potential suspects. By late fall and early winter of 1984, 7 months after Karen's murder, Detective Tosi felt like he was grabbing at straws. He'd asked the Florida Crime Unit to take another look at all the fingerprints and that footprint, he'd asked for a psychological workup of the possible murderer, and he'd also followed up on reports of a possible prowler in Gulfport, someone who was peering into windows and watching residents go about their nighttime rituals. He had also circled back to David Mackey, who was repeatedly asking police about what progress they'd made on the case, as a prime suspect. Even though it appeared that David was in Rhode Island at the time of the murder, the investigator had not been able to rule out the possibility that David had made an overnight airplane trip back to Florida to murder Karen and then returned to Rhode Island by the next morning. But, like the detective's other prime suspects, David 100% passed a lie detector test, and by Thanksgiving of 1984, the detective felt like once again he was back to square one. And even if he had a viable suspect, Detective Tosi had no physical evidence that he could use to link that person to the scene of the crime. It wasn't until Christmas of 1984 that police received the tip that would help them uncover the identity of Karen's murderer. At a farewell party for Gulfport's departing town manager, a casual conversation between an off-duty police officer and one of the city's bus drivers resulted in a complete rethinking of the murder investigation. What Detective Tosi discovered when he followed up on the story told by the bus driver, who lived 3 blocks away from Karen and David's house in Gulfport, would send shockwaves throughout Pinellas County and then all of Florida. Based on the follow-up investigation into that new information, here is a reconstruction of what law enforcement officials believe happened to Karen Gregory in the early morning hours of May 23, 1984. It was sometime after midnight when Karen gave her friend Navern a big hug and thanked her for the dinner and conversation. And it was not long after that Karen pulled her little Volkswagen car into her driveway, and then after getting her last few boxes of things from her trunk, she headed inside, locked the door, and sat down to relax. But just a few minutes later, she heard a knock on the front door. Given she was alone, and it was the middle of the night, Karen was likely startled and maybe even a little scared by the sound. But she still stood up and made her way over to the door. When she got there, she called out to see who was knocking. When she heard the person reply, Karen was instantly put at ease, and she unlocked and opened the door. As the door in front of him opened, Karen's killer felt a rush of excitement. For a while now, he had been watching Karen from a distance, and up close, looking at her now, Karen was even better looking than the killer had realized, with that dark brown hair and those eyes that were almost electric blue in her tanned face. The killer's first wife had hated his habit of staring at women, sizing them up as sexual partners. But tonight, the killer wasn't there just to look. He was there to actually have sex with Karen. Except when the killer had just casually stepped through Karen's open front doorway into her house before she had even invited him inside, Karen did not look remotely interested in him. And when the killer reached out and touched Karen, she had practically slapped him, pushing him away from her. And right then, something in this man snapped. It was the same feeling the killer had had when he'd wrapped his hands around his first wife's neck and squeezed her throat and told her to shut up and stop nagging him. Only that time, he'd stopped himself. This time, he wouldn't. The killer pulled out a knife and showed Karen, and then quickly began shoving and dragging her down the hallway toward her bedroom. Once inside, the killer ripped off Karen's shorts and underwear, and then made her put on that black lingerie that he had found in one of her drawers, and then the killer flung himself on Karen and began to rape her. As he did, he began pressing the knife into Karen's chest, just below her collarbone. And when it finally broke the skin, Karen struck him to get him to stop. But instead of her blow causing the killer to stop, it enraged him, and he began stabbing Karen repeatedly around her neck. But just as he started to do this, Karen somehow managed to break free and make a run for the front door. And she had almost escaped. She'd gotten through the front door all the way to the front porch door with these slats of glass panes over the screen. It was then that Karen screamed that terrible piercing scream before the killer had caught up to her, grabbed her, and pulled her back into the house, smashing her head into the glass panes, causing them to shatter out onto the walkway. It had taken all of the killer's strength to pull Karen back inside of the living room and then back down the hallway toward the bedroom. And even then, Karen somehow broke free a second time and lunged for the bathroom. The killer had had to step onto these slippery bathroom tiles to pull Karen out into the hallway again before wrestling her to the floor. And that was where he finished his attack, beating and stabbing Karen until she was finally and completely still, lying on her side in the carpeted hallway. The medical examiner would later make a list of Karen's wounds. One of her hands was cut and scratched, one of her fingers broken, her face, head, and upper body covered with so much blood from 13 separate stab wounds to either side of her neck that it was impossible to see the slash the killer had also made straight across her throat. Finally, the killer stood up, his chest heaving, and his bare feet pressing into the blood-soaked carpet. And as he looked around the dim, blood-spattered hallway, the killer suddenly seemed to realize what he had done. Just a few minutes earlier, he'd seen Karen from his garage, watched her unpack the boxes from the back of her car, and suddenly he'd thought of the perfect excuse to get into the house with her. A moment later, he'd been at her door, knocking, calling out his name so she wouldn't be scared, letting her know that he just wanted to make sure everything was fine because he'd noticed that she'd come home late. And as a firefighter and the unofficial head of the neighborhood crime watch, George Lewis, the guy who lived just across the street from her and David, was just checking to make sure Karen was okay. Standing in the hallway now, George wasn't even sure how long he'd been inside of David Mackey's house. But George did know that he had to get out before anyone came, and before Glenda, his soon-to-be wife and soon-to-be mother of his first child, began to wonder where he'd gone and why he wasn't still in the garage working on his motorcycle. A moment later, George was climbing out the window of David and Karen's bedroom, leaving bloody marks on the sill and the curtain. Then he was running barefoot back to his house across the street, past the Crime Watch sign he'd posted so prominently on his property, and around to the back of the garage where he would wash Karen's blood off under the outside faucet. From there, George would walk into the kitchen and tell Glenda not to worry, that the scream she had just heard was nothing. He'd checked it out, there was no disturbance anywhere, they were safe. Later, after he had showered and was lying in bed with Glenda, George could not believe his luck. No one in the neighborhood had called to report Karen's scream, and Karen's body would go undiscovered for more than 30 hours. The medical examiner would later say that if someone had called the police after hearing the scream, there was a good chance that Karen could have survived her injuries. But by late summer, George's luck began to run out. Detective Tosi kept coming back to talk to George about the murder. The men were good friends, close enough that on December 15th, Larry Tosi would actually perform the wedding ceremony when George and his fiancée Glenda got married at the St. Petersburg fire station where George worked. And at first, the detective had come back to George in case the firefighter and leader of the neighborhood crime watch could remember anything new about the night that Karen was killed. After all, George had been the only neighbor who actually made any attempt to investigate the cause of that scream. And even when George began to slightly change his story, the detective just thought that George must be remembering additional details, not that George himself could be the murderer. It wasn't until that farewell party in December that Detective Tosi realized there was a fatal flaw in what George had been telling the police. During that party, the Gulfport bus driver, who lived a full 3 blocks away from David and Karen's house, told that off-duty police officer that even from that far distance, 3 blocks, she had heard Karen scream that night loud and clear. And if that was true, how was it possible that George, who lived literally right across the street from Karen and David, had only heard what he described as a, quote, faint scream? Even if George had had his radio on like he claimed, Karen's scream had to have been much louder than what George was reporting. And when Detective Tosi pressed George to explain this discrepancy, George's story started to unravel. And as he kept offering new versions of events for the night of Karen's murder, he also began to fail lie detector tests as well. In his original statement to police given on May 24th, 1984, George had said he'd left his garage after hearing the scream, and after looking up and down his street, he'd seen nothing. In February of 1985, George told police that his earlier statement had actually been inaccurate. He said that after hearing the scream, he had looked across the street and seen a man standing on David and Karen's front lawn. And even from that far away from the other side of the road in the dark, George said he had been able to see every detail of what the man was wearing and what he looked like. When a police reconstruction of this scenario proved that it would have been impossible for George to see anyone that clearly from the door of his garage in the middle of the night, George just changed his story again, saying that, well, after he heard the scream, he had left his garage and walked closer to Karen and David's property, which is how he was able to see this mystery man on their property so clearly. And George said the reason he had not initially told police about this mystery man was because this man had threatened him that night, saying he would hurt him and his family if he ever reported seeing him. In George's final statement to police on March 15th, George told detectives that after this mystery man had made this threat, he had left Karen and David's property, at which point George, being curious, went inside of Karen and David's home, and at that point, he actually saw Karen dead on the floor. He told police he'd seen the slit across her throat, a detail that had not been publicly reported, and an injury that had been totally hidden by all the blood from Karen's other wounds. To police, the only way George would know that Karen had her throat slashed would be if he was the one slashing it. And even though the police had no actual proof that George had committed this murder, police suspicions deepened after they interviewed George's first wife. According to George's ex, during their year-long marriage, George had at times been violent and aggressive, like the time he had locked his hands around her throat and started to strangle her. She also described his habit of leering at women and looking constantly at pornography, as well as his overtly racist observations about African Americans. But it wasn't until Detective Tosi asked the FBI to run an analysis of the partial footprint left on the bathroom tile near Karen's body that police finally had the physical evidence they needed to link George to Karen's murder. Where the state crime lab had failed to come up with an image clear enough to match prints from potential suspects, the FBI had succeeded. And the bloody heel print on the bathroom floor, as well as the bare footprints left in the blood-soaked carpet, were an exact match to the footprint belonging to George Lewis, the man police now also suspected might be Gulfport's mystery prowler and peeping Tom. On March 15, 1985, Detective Tosi arrested George for the first-degree murder of Karen Gregory. After a lengthy trial and appeal, during which George testified on his own behalf that he had nothing to do with Karen's death, George was found guilty of both first-degree murder and sexual battery. And on June 2, 1989, 5 years after Karen Gregory's brutal rape and murder, 27-year-old George Lewis was sentenced to life in prison. 1 year later, in June of 1990, George's wife, Glenda, filed for divorce and sole custody of their 2 children. As for David Mackey, he moved out of the home he had shared with Karen and settled in Tampa, Florida, where he continued his career providing assistance and counseling services to veterans. George Lewis would die in prison in 2015. He was 52 years old. We'd like to give a special thanks to author and journalist Thomas French, whose series of newspaper articles and his book, Unanswered Cries, A True Story of Friends, Neighbors, and Murder in a Small Town, were our main sources in creating this episode. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please go into the Amazon Music follow button's refrigerator and ever so slightly uncap all of their beer bottles so they all go flat. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In 1995, a teenager named Reggie was serving a life sentence inside one of the most dangerous prisons in the United States. From the time he got there, Reggie tried to keep his head down in order to avoid trouble, but at some point, he upset a man that was known as the Devil. And when you upset the devil, you're doomed. But Reggie wasn't prepared to just roll over and die, and so he devised a plan to save himself. What happened next was so shocking that it made international headlines. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the 5-star review button to your barbecue, where you only serve enormous portions of food on flimsy paper plates. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Reggie Cole was just a child when his family moved from Louisiana to an area of Los Angeles, California called South Central. When the Coles arrived in 1985, South Central, which had a population of 500,000 people, was seeing a huge uptick in gang violence and drug dealing. But by the time Reggie, the youngest of the 5 Cole children, had turned 10 years old, the family had managed to move from an apartment on 98th Street, in one of the most dangerous areas of South Central, to 71st Street, one of the few somewhat safe neighborhoods in the area. They lived in a small tan bungalow that had a neat front yard that was bordered by rose bushes and shaded by palm and eucalyptus trees. Reggie's mother was a deeply religious woman. She made sure all of her children attended the local Missionary Baptist church every Sunday. She was also strict and told her 2 daughters and 3 sons that they had to be inside the house every night before the streetlights came on. Reggie's stepfather, who had raised the Cole kids as if they were his own, worked in an aluminum factory. He was from a small town in Louisiana, and in their new South Central neighborhood, he became known for his soul food. On Sundays, the Cole children always looked forward to a big meal of red beans, rice, black-eyed peas, and collards. But for one of the Cole children, the middle son named Kenny, home was not on 71st Street. For him, home was the old neighborhood where the family had lived on 98th Street, where Kenny was part of a violent gang called Nine Deuce Hoover Crips. And when Kenny was 15 and Reggie was 10, Kenny was killed in that old neighborhood in a drive-by shooting. His killer was never caught. Reggie was devastated. Always small and skinny, he had idolized his older brother, and Kenny had always protected Reggie from neighborhood bullies. For a while after the murder of his brother, Reggie continued to do well in school. He got good marks in junior high and joined his other brother as an usher in church on Sundays, and he kept up with school social events, playing basketball and attending his junior high prom. But by the time Reggie was 2 years into high school, all that had changed. Reggie, who had inherited his deceased brother's friends and gang affiliations from the old neighborhood, was gradually sinking deeper and deeper into gang life. Because of his goofy attitude, Reggie became known to his brother's friends as Gumby. Although he still lived at home with his mom, Reggie had moved out of her house and into a shed in her backyard. His family called him Reggie, but now he preferred his street name, Gumby. And he'd started dressing down, which meant wearing the oversized jogging suits and sports apparel and expensive sneakers that marked him as a gang member. Then, in his senior year, he dropped out of high school, and at the same time, his mom and stepfather separated. Once he was out of school, Reggie spent all of his time on the streets, or in his shed, where the walls were covered with gang graffiti and where he now grew 2 marijuana plants right outside the shed door. The gulf between Reggie's life and that of his siblings and mother also continued to grow. One of Reggie's older sisters was a bus driver and a choir director at the Missionary Baptist Church. His other sister had just enrolled in college, and Reggie's older brother was a hospital equipment operator. Reggie's brother-in-law had offered him work in his plumbing business, but Reggie wasn't interested. He always drifted back to his gang in the old neighborhood. So it was a huge disappointment to his mom, but not exactly unexpected, when Reggie, at the age of 16, had his first arrest after failing to stop for a police officer, and his second arrest later that same year for getting caught carrying a weapon. A year after that, in 1993, when Reggie was 17, the homicide rate in South Central had skyrocketed to the point where 7 people were being killed there every week. And Reggie was at ground zero for all of that street violence, selling crack at motels along the Figueroa corridor. Running 30 miles north and south through the city, Figueroa is one of the longest streets in Los Angeles, and today it has the highest arrest rate in the city for prostitution. Finally, in 1995, when Reggie was 19, his gang affiliations and his criminal behavior caught up with him. On August 1st of that year, Reggie was found guilty of fatally shooting a man who was standing outside of a known prostitution house on Figueroa Street. Reggie was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Immediately after the sentence was read, Reggie was placed in a holding cell at a county supermax facility in South Central until a prison transport bus could take him to his new home 3.5 hours away in Imperial County. That new home was Calipatria State Prison, one of the most violent maximum security prisons in the California correctional system. A few days later, on the day Reggie was set to leave for Calipatria, he was thin and lanky, standing at almost 6 feet tall, but weighing just 140 pounds. He was also still wearing the orange jumpsuit he'd been wearing in county jail. Only now, as he climbed onto the prison transport bus in leg and ankle chains, the orange suit marked him as a brand new prisoner, or fresh fish, in the eyes of the level 4 offenders he would be spending the rest of his life with in Calipatria. As the bus headed east from the county jail in Los Angeles and crossed from the heart of the city into the desert, Reggie began to realize just how bad his situation really was. He was not just traveling to a new jail, he was leaving behind everyone and everything he had ever known. About 3 hours later, while looking out the window of the bus, Reggie got his first glimpse of Calipatria Prison off in the distance. Its sprawling 325-acre complex of fences, towers, exercise pens, and 2-story cell blocks sat in the middle of more than 1,200 acres of sandy, desolate no-man's land. As Reggie sat there staring, He suddenly realized he was soaked with sweat, despite the fact that the bus was running its air conditioning on full blast. But Reggie had no idea how comfortable that bus ride was relative to where he was going. In Calipatria prison, when inmates were sent outside to the asphalt-covered exercise yard, there was almost no shade, and temperatures routinely reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the height of summer, temperatures could reach as high as 118 degrees Fahrenheit. And winters in Calipatria were actually just as bad as the summers, but for the opposite reason. During those months, temperatures would plunge well below freezing at night. As the bus rambled down the road, getting closer and closer to Calipatria, Reggie started to smell the cow manure from the cattle feedlots they were passing by. Reggie bent his head down toward his shackled hands to try to cover his nose, not realizing that there was absolutely no getting away from that smell. It would literally permeate every inch of his new home. Finally, the bus reached the prison. Before entering the prison grounds, the bus had to pass through a heavily guarded and fortified opening in a 13-foot-high electric fence topped with razor wire that outlined the perimeter of the maximum security area of Calipatria. The purpose of this fence, which had enough voltage in it to instantly kill anyone who touched it, was to cut down on prison escapes, and to allow correctional officers, who were outnumbered more than 50-1 by prisoners, to move from guarding the perimeter to patrolling the inside of the prison. However, this shift in manpower had done very little to stop the violence inside the prison. There was hardly anyone in California, including Reggie, who hadn't heard news reports about the horrible attack that had happened in Calipatria 3 months earlier. 5 inmates armed with homemade knives stabbed and beat 8 prison guards. None of the guards died, but the incident sent shockwaves through the state. After passing through the perimeter fence, Reggie's bus continued on towards the main prison. As they got closer, Reggie suddenly felt scared and wished the bus ride could go on for a little bit longer so he wouldn't have to get off. The bus finally reached a large garage just off of one of the main buildings. When the bus pulled into the garage, the inmates saw several guards standing around inside, clearly waiting for them. And behind these guards on the wall was a big security door that led into the prison. It actually went into an area called Receiving and Discharge, or R&D. R&D is where new inmates are cataloged, inventoried, and booked into the prison system and their specific prison facility. The bus driver pulled into the designated parking spot in the garage and then came to a complete stop. As the bus engine idled and Reggie and all of the other fresh fish sat anxiously on the bus, one of the guards outside, who was carrying a clipboard, stepped onto the bus and chatted with the driver for a moment. Then the guard turned and faced Reggie and the other men on board and started calling out their names one by one. As he did, each man got up and, with their hands and feet in shackles, they shuffled to the back of the bus, where another guard had opened the back door. There, they would walk down 2 steps to the garage floor. The guard at the back of the bus would then yell at them to make their way over to the door that led into R&D, and there, standing outside that door, were several more guards, all armed with pepper spray and batons, who would pat each man down and search them. After the men were searched, they were motioned to walk through the door into R&D. Although the chains and shackles he was wearing had already drilled into Reggie the fact that his life was now totally changed, he was still not prepared for the shock he felt when he finally stepped through the R&D door and was actually inside the prison. Inside, a guard watched every move Reggie made, and security glass and wire separated Reggie from the men and women who processed his paperwork. What little he had brought with him was about to be inventoried and put into a storage compartment. His only possessions going forward would be the items that prison officials would give him over the next several hours. After stepping into a big windowless room, he was told to take off his clothes, and then a guard with gloves on did the first of hundreds of strip searches that would become a routine part of Reggie's life. Then he was handed his prison-issue clothing and told to get dressed. After he was given his inmate ID card that he would keep with him at all times. Reggie was also given 2 blankets, 2 sheets, a washcloth, a pillowcase, soap, toothpaste, and a toothbrush. After leaving R&D, Reggie was walked to his cell. In Calipatria, the cell blocks were all 2 stories high, with each cell door facing out toward a common area that the guards patrolled. Unlike what most people imagine when they think of jail cells, These cells did not have bars with lots of openings to look through. The cell walls were concrete, with no windows, and the doors were heavy sheet metal with only 2 small vertical slits that were windows that they could look through out into the common area. Inside of Calipatria, every sound reverberated off of the concrete and metal, meaning it was always noisy and extremely difficult to sleep. As Reggie was led by the guard to his cell, the awful sounds echoing all around of people yelling and banging on things were so distracting and awful that his initial impulse was just to run away to somewhere that was quiet. But, of course, as soon as he had that impulse, he remembered that he'll never be able to do that, ever. This was his reality. When Reggie finally entered his single-person cell and heard the door shut behind him, he felt himself relax just a little bit. He looked around his tiny room and saw a metal sink and a toilet, as well as a bunk bed. And as he looked at the bunk bed, it took him a second to process that there was another person laying on it. Although Calipatria had only opened 3 years earlier, in 1992, by the time Reggie arrived, it was already completely overcrowded, which is why single-person cells like this one now held 2 people. The man laying in the bottom bunk stared at Reggie. Reggie looked away. He knew better than to try to be friends with this man. Keeping his head down and making sure he did not touch the lower bunk where his cellmate was still watching him, Reggie awkwardly made up the top bunk with the sheet and blankets he'd been given in R&D. Then, once his bed was made, Reggie walked a few feet over to the metal toilet. He did his business. Then, without a word, he hauled himself up onto the top bunk, where he lay staring at the ceiling in silence. Within the first few weeks of Reggie's arrival, he was given his first lesson in prison survival. He was out in the exercise yard when an older inmate who was sitting on top of one of the picnic tables motioned Reggie over. With his elbows propped on his knees, the inmate stared at Reggie as if sizing him up. Then he told Reggie, "You need to find people from your neighborhood, and then you need to join one of the gangs. And if possible, you join the same gang that you ran with on the outside. And don't trust anyone. No one here is your friend. Oh, and make yourself a knife." Reggie thanked him and decided he would take his advice. Inside the prison, Reggie began scanning the inmates for tattoos that signified they were in the Crips, like he had been when he was still a free man. Outside in the yard, Reggie continued to scan the inmates, but he kept to the perimeter where he couldn't be seen as disrespecting anyone or invading their space. Reggie also always carried a homemade knife, which was a toothbrush he had filed down against the concrete. But before Reggie was invited to join a gang, which would offer him protection, he was challenged. Reggie had been making his usual perimeter walk out in the yard when a bigger inmate and a few of his crew walked over and stood in front of Reggie, blocking his path. Then the main guy started muscling Reggie against the fence. Reggie already knew what happened to fresh fish who did not stand up to the first sign of any kind of disrespect or aggression. In fact, he'd seen it over and over again right in his own cell. His cellmate, the same one who had been laying on the bottom bunk when Reggie first arrived, had made the mistake of thinking a few visitors to their cell, men neither of them knew, were there as friends. His cellmate had welcomed them inside and shook hands with them, while Reggie had remained on the top bunk and pretended to be asleep. The men who had come inside immediately grabbed Reggie's cellmate, threw him on the ground, and raped him. When they were done, they left without touching Reggie. Because Reggie's cellmate had not fought back during this first assault, these men would come back many more times, and each time Reggie would be forced to listen to it while he lay still and silent in his top bunk. And like most of the inmate-on-inmate attacks at this prison, the rapes went unreported. Even if a guard took a charge like that seriously, the consequences of snitching on another inmate were much worse than any punishment a correctional guard could deal out. So, out in the yard, as Reggie found himself being muscled against the fence by this big guy, the thought of his cellmate being raped over and over again ran through Reggie's mind. He knew he had to stand up for himself. So Reggie reached into his waistband, he grabbed his homemade knife, and he stabbed the bigger inmate in the side. His aim was not to deliver a wound that would kill, or be so serious that the guards would have to investigate, but to use his weapon for defense and intimidation. From that day forward, while Reggie would never be known as a brawler, he did start to build a reputation as someone who was quick to use his blade. and therefore someone who was not to be messed with. Shortly after this stabbing, Reggie was welcomed into a gang called the 49 Deuce Crips. All the Crips at Calipatria were run by a single man, one of the most violent inmates there, a 200-pound bodybuilder named Eddie Clark, who went by the nickname El Diablo, or the Devil. For El Diablo, Calipatria was not just his home, it was his business. Calipatria was known as a money prison, where drugs were just as pervasive as unchecked violence. Reggie had seen dozens of inmates smuggle crack and heroin around the prison. They would put the drugs inside balloons before inserting them into their bodies, a practice that was extremely risky because the balloon could break or disintegrate once it was inside of them. And all this was part of the drug empire that was ruled by El Diablo. Even the guards recognized his power as Calipatria's shot caller, allowing him to wear a bright orange do-rag wrapped around his head out in the prison yard. Under the general protection of his new gang and their leader, El Diablo, Reggie's life got noticeably better. Not only was he now much more safe at the prison, but being a part of this gang also allowed Reggie to feel somewhat human again, whether it was playing basketball or leaning up against the picnic tables and chatting with fellow gang members. Reggie finally had people around him that he felt like he could trust. But, like everyone else in the Deuce Crips, Reggie did his best not to interact with or attract any attention from El Diablo. Because even though El Diablo was their boss and main protector, they were all afraid of him. El Diablo was only 34 years old, but he had spent 20 of those years behind bars. When he was a juvenile, he beat another teenager to death. When he was an adult, he sexually assaulted an elderly woman and shot her son in the course of robbing their house. In prison, El Diablo was known to turn on people, even his own people, suddenly, viciously, and without warning. The Devil was also connected to prison staff. 2 years after he'd entered prison, he'd fallen in love with one of the corrections officers who oversaw one of the common areas where the Devil spent time. He wrote her an 8-page-long love letter where he told her that, quote, she had 75% of his heart. This was apparently enough for Lisa Finch, who eventually quit her job as a prison guard, married El Diablo, and on her visits to him in Calipatria, she smuggled in PCP-laced cigarettes that he could sell to other inmates. Over the next 4 years, Reggie carved out a relatively safe life for himself in Calipatria. He had managed to fit in with his new gang without upsetting El Diablo. He also managed to avoid making any real enemies outside of his gang. Over the course of those 4 years, Reggie spent much of his time exercising, which added some muscle to his thin frame. He also got several tattoos, including a Ghetto Star prison tattoo on his shoulders, as well as 2 Crips tattoos on his chest and stomach. But despite settling into a routine and starting to feel relatively comfortable, Reggie knew he and everyone else at that prison had a big problem. By 2000, so 5 years into Reggie's prison sentence, El Diablo had gone from just being a very intimidating inmate to being a monster. He would attack virtually anyone for virtually anything. Sometimes all it took was looking at him wrong to get stabbed or beaten or raped. This, of course, made life inside of the prison even more precarious than it already was, as no one knew who El Diablo's next target was going to be. By the fall of 2000, the Devil, who was now manufacturing alcohol from the fruit juice he stole from the prison kitchens, had developed such a substance abuse problem that some of his own fellow gang members had tried, unsuccessfully, to stage an intervention. As one inmate recalled, when he was drunk, he was an animal. If he raped you, nobody was going to say anything. But it would turn out that out of all the violent and dangerous offenders in Calipatria who might have stood up to El Diablo and challenged his authority, it would be Reggie, one of the least ruthless inmates, who would finally do it. In late October of that year, an inmate using a slingshot fired a homemade dart at one of the corrections officers out in the prison yard. The dart missed and stuck into a gate post instead. Immediately, the guards ordered all the inmates to lay on the ground so they could do a weapons check to see who had thrown the dart. The guards didn't discover who had thrown it. However, during their search, they did find a homemade knife inside of a cotton glove laying out in the grass. The guards didn't know this, but the knife belonged to El Diablo's cellmate, who was one of El Diablo's most trusted lieutenants. And so as the guards picked up the knife and began asking whose it was, every inmate in the yard knew El Diablo was going to do something to protect his cellmate from getting caught. El Diablo's eyes traveled across the yard and came to a stop on Reggie Cole, who just happened to be out on work assignment painting one of the prison walls that faced into the yard. Reggie was already serving a life sentence without parole, so adding a weapons charge wouldn't actually change his sentence. Paintbrush in hand, Reggie held his breath, but even with his eyes down, he could feel El Diablo's sudden attention and the silence that filled the yard. Reggie looked up and saw the devil staring right at him. Then El Diablo made a single motion with his hand, pointing to the knife in the corrections officer's hand. He might as well have shouted his order. "You, Reggie, you take the blame for this." For just a moment, Reggie's mind went blank. Then he saw in his mind what would happen if he agreed to do this for the devil. He might be sent to solitary confinement. He might have his family visitation rights revoked. And he would be publicly submitting to another inmate, which would make him look weak. And if he agreed to submit this one time, then he'd likely spend the rest of his life at Calipatria under the thumb of other inmates. So with El Diablo staring at him expectantly, Reggie paused and then said the words that changed the course of his and El Diablo's life. "No, not my knife," Reggie said. The silence that followed this statement was deafening. Even the corrections officers looked stunned. Reggie did not look at El Diablo, but both men knew at that moment Reggie was now a marked man. El Diablo would make sure that Reggie paid the highest price possible for refusing this direct order. Over the next 4 weeks, Reggie expected to be attacked by El Diablo or one of his henchmen at any moment. As the nights grew colder, Reggie would lie in his bunk, sleepless, thinking about his options. The way he saw it, there were only 4 of them. He could submit to El Diablo and do whatever he wanted to pay for his insubordination. He could snitch on El Diablo to the guards. He could kill El Diablo, or he could be killed by El Diablo. Reggie obsessed over these 4 choices. He'd pace around the perimeter of the exercise yard, keeping a very wide berth around El Diablo, weighing out the pros and cons of each action. Finally, Reggie made up his mind. He didn't know exactly how it was going to happen, but he knew he'd be ready when the time was right. It all happened on the morning of November 28, 2000, roughly 1 month after Reggie had refused to take the blame for the knife. That day, Reggie was walking around the perimeter of the exercise yard when he noticed the devil walking toward him. The devil wasn't even trying to sneak up on Reggie. It seemed like he wanted Reggie to know that he was about to get attacked. Reggie stopped and just watched the devil as he got closer, not really sure what he should do. When the devil was finally right in front of him, he didn't say anything. He just reached out and grabbed Reggie's shoulder with his left hand, and then with his right, he drove a knife into Reggie's side. Not far enough to be a lethal blow, but enough to send a very painful message that Reggie's days were numbered. As he pulled the knife out of Reggie, El Diablo leaned forward and whispered into Reggie's ear, "You are my bitch." And then he chucked the knife onto the grass and casually walked away. Reggie pressed his hand over his wound, he gritted his teeth, and he walked in the opposite direction of El Diablo over towards the fence. There was nothing anyone could do for him. The guards made no sign of having even noticed the attack, and even if they had, Reggie, like other victims of El Diablo's violence, would have lied. About 15 minutes later, a bell sounded, signaling the exercise period was over. The guards and inmates knew the drill. The inmates would line up and be searched for weapons or contraband before they were allowed to re-enter the cell blocks. El Diablo was ahead of Reggie in the line. Reggie, hiding his stab wound under the waistband of his pants, stood there quietly, clutching a 6-inch-long knife that he had dug out of its hiding place near the fence just minutes after he had been attacked by El Diablo. A corrections officer ordered El Diablo to turn around while he was still in line and to stretch out his arms so he could be searched. The devil did this, and as he was turned around, he stared menacingly at Reggie. On the devil's right forearm, there was a tattoo of a hand gripping a sword. On his right ribcage was a self-portrait of El Diablo slitting a man's throat. Looking up and finally meeting El Diablo's eyes, Reggie suddenly leapt over the crouched prison guard who was between them searching El Diablo, and Reggie drove the point of his homemade knife directly into the front of El Diablo's throat. El Diablo, still staring at Reggie, but now with a look of terror on his face, staggered backwards and off to the side. The blade had gone straight through his voice box, and blood was now pouring out of that 1-inch hole in the center of his neck. Reggie immediately threw himself to the ground, putting his hands behind his back. As he laid there looking up at the stunned El Diablo, Reggie knew the wound he had just inflicted was fatal. As everyone else in the yard also got down on the ground and guards started firing off their cans of pepper spray, Reggie told one of the nearby guards, "I know what I did. I know what I did." By the time the doctor arrived 30 minutes later, El Diablo was dead. By late that afternoon, Reggie had been placed into solitary confinement. Other inmates may have hated and feared El Diablo, but by killing Calapatria's shot caller, El Diablo's lieutenants would be gunning for Reggie. Not only that, Reggie now faced another murder charge. If he was convicted, the only punishment left was the death penalty. And no one contested the fact that Reggie had committed this murder. There had been dozens of eyewitnesses, including prison guards, who had seen Reggie fatally stab El Diablo. Also, there was security camera footage, and there was Reggie's own confession, one that he never tried to recant. Instead, Reggie actually went on record saying that he felt bad for killing El Diablo because El Diablo was a human being who had a family that was going to hurt when they heard the news. But Reggie also insisted that he murdered El Diablo in self-defense. If a judge accepted this, the first-degree murder charge would be dropped to manslaughter and Reggie would escape the death penalty, but he would still face 10 years in solitary confinement. Both outcomes seemed so grim that even to Reggie, hiring a lawyer and preparing a defense seemed both hopeless and pointless. When Reggie was handed a list of county-approved attorneys, he looked at it, but none of the names meant anything to him. However, it would turn out that Reggie's random choice of a lawyer named Christopher Plord would be the second most important decision of his life, right after his decision to kill El Diablo. Because over the course of the next 3 years, his lawyer, Christopher Plord, dressed in his crumpled suits and peering out from behind his wire-rimmed glasses, would make a huge discovery about Reggie that would change everything. And the way Christopher made that discovery was by digging into the murder case that had landed Reggie in Calipatria in the first place. 6 years before the murder of El Diablo, late on the night of Monday, March 28, 1994, 2 LAPD homicide detectives arrived at the scene of a murder. It was right outside of a known house of prostitution on Figueroa Street, the street in South Central that Reggie used to spend a lot of his time on. The victim was a 29-year-old man named Felipe Gonzalez Angeles. He was found lying on the ground with a gunshot wound in his back. The police located the prostitution house manager, a pimp named John Jones, who also became their star eyewitness. According to John, who saw the attack from the second-floor window of the house, he said Felipe showed up to the house that night in a car with 2 other men. Felipe had gotten out, he had walked up to the door and knocked loudly. When one of John's staff members had opened the door, Felipe had asked to see a specific prostitute, but he was told she was busy. So Felipe turned around and started walking back toward the car where his other 2 friends were. But before he could get to the car, 3 teenagers, 2 of which had guns, appeared out of the darkness and demanded Felipe give them his money. They also yelled at Felipe's 2 friends who were in the car to do the same thing. But Felipe and his friends didn't speak English and just stood there seeming confused. At which point, the teenagers just started shooting at Felipe and his friends in the car. Felipe got hit in the back as he tried to flee, and his friends, they sped off in the car. The teenagers turned and ran down an alley, but before they disappeared, John said he noticed one of them was limping. John figured in the chaos, this teen had gotten accidentally shot in the leg by his own friend or even by himself potentially. A few weeks after the murder, a tip from police working a different crime altogether would lead those 2 LAPD detectives who arrived at Felipe's murder scene to Reggie Cole and his friend and fellow Crip, Obie Anthony, who were both in jail at the time on charges of suspected carjacking. One of the 2 detectives brought Reggie into an interrogation room, and during the questioning, the detective examined Reggie's legs, and very quickly, he found a gunshot wound. Based on the presence of this gunshot wound on Reggie's leg and the eyewitness testimony of the pimp, John Jones, Reggie and Obi were both found guilty of murdering Felipe Angeles, and they both were sentenced to life in prison without parole. But looking at that case 6 years later, with his client, Reggie, in solitary confinement facing yet another murder charge, all Christopher Plord saw were some very big cracks in the LAPD investigation. Over the next 3 years, Christopher unearthed forensic evidence showing that the bullet that killed Felipe had not been fired from street level, but rather from above, maybe even from the roof or from John Jones's own apartment window. There were no fingerprints at the crime scene that matched Reggie's or Obi's, and no witness could ever identify Reggie as the shooter. John Jones himself had retracted his own testimony, saying that he had told the cops what they wanted to hear in exchange for a lighter sentence when it came to his own crime of running a prostitution house. But by far, the most surprising and damning discovery Christopher made about Reggie's case had to do with the wound on Reggie's leg. It was indeed a gunshot wound. However, it was not anywhere near recent. It was the result of an accident that had happened to Reggie when he was 13 years old, 5 years prior to the murder of Felipe Angeles. And when the LAPD detectives saw this wound in the interrogation room, they would have known it could not possibly have happened recently. It was just a big scar, and Reggie clearly wasn't affected by it. He was not limping at all. In addition to the extremely flimsy case against Reggie for that murder charge, another factor that enhanced the likelihood that Reggie was innocent was Reggie's own behavior after getting convicted. In Calipatria, where violence was power and inmates proudly talked about being killers, Reggie was one of the only inmates who insisted he was not a killer, that he was innocent of his crime. And whenever he wasn't in his cell or working or exercising in the yard, he was spending hours in the prison law library researching wrongful convictions. In February 2008, after Reggie had spent 14 years in prison, 8 of those years in solitary confinement, his lawyer, Christopher Plord, took Reggie's original murder case back to court. And this time, the judge decided that Reggie was innocent, that he had been wrongfully convicted. Following that decision, the state prosecutor agreed to drop the capital murder charge against Reggie in the death of El Diablo. Instead, he reduced the charge to 10 years in solitary confinement for manslaughter, agreeing that in killing El Diablo, Reggie had acted in self-defense. By the time that ruling came down, Reggie had already spent 8 years in solitary, which were counted towards his 10-year solitary sentence. So, 2 long years later, on May 15, 2009, Reggie Cole finished his solitary confinement sentence and walked out of Calipatria State Prison. He was a free man once again. But Reggie was hardly a happy man. Wrongfully imprisoned for a murder he did not commit, Reggie was only cleared and made free again because of a murder he did commit, and this haunts him. After Reggie's friend, Obi Anthony, was also determined to have been wrongfully convicted, he too was released. In October 2012, the city of Los Angeles paid $8.3 million to Obi Anthony, and in January 2017, it paid $5.2 million to Reggie Cole. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the 5-star review button to your barbecue, where you only serve enormous portions of food on flimsy paper plates. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Around 2 a.m. on April 6, 2018, a mysterious person walked down a snowy suburban street in Wadsworth, Ohio. At some point, this person came to a stop in front of a modest two-story home. At that point, the mystery person looked around to make sure no one was watching them, and then they turned away from the road and walked down the driveway toward the backyard of the property. What this person did next was unspeakably cruel, and it was caught on camera. This story includes graphic descriptions of violence as well as sexual content. As such, listener discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the 5-star review button to come on over for a fun pizza party, but when they get there, only serve fermented herring. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Margaret Douglas loved sitting out on the front porch of her neat gray house in Wadsworth, Ohio. Settled comfortably into one of the white wicker chairs that overlooked her 6-foot-high rhododendron bushes with their clusters of purple flowers, she knew all of her neighbors by name. And she also knew by heart the daily rhythms of this quiet street in a town of fewer than 2,400 residents. Wadsworth was one of those tiny middle American towns that you could find pictured on a postcard. And since Margaret and her husband had arrived in this town back in 1959, not much had changed. Now, in the early spring of 2018, Margaret was 98 years old, and the chilly April air was still keeping her inside. But even though Margaret lived alone these days, she had plenty of wonderful memories to keep her company, along with regular visits from a few close relatives and from a few of the neighbors who had become her good friends. Margaret had been born in 1919, just 1 year after World War I had come to a bloody close. By the time Margaret was just 25 years old, she had already lived through Prohibition, which was a 13-year-long ban on the production, sale, and consumption of alcohol in the United States, and she'd also lived through the Roaring Twenties and the Age of Jazz, which was a period in the 1920s and the 1930s. On December 6, 1941, Margaret and her family had listened in shock to the first news reports about the Japanese attack on the U.S. naval fleet in Pearl Harbor that catapulted the United States into World War II. And it was after World War II ended in 1945 that Margaret, at the age of 39, met and married her husband, Donald Douglas, a World War II U.S. Army veteran. For her whole life, Margaret had been a person who held firm opinions and wasn't afraid to share them with the world. And in her husband, Donald, Margaret had found the perfect match. Once they were married and settled into their 3-bedroom house in Wadsworth, together they bucked convention. Instead of having children, they centered their lives around each other, on travel, and on their careers. Margaret loved her job in nearby Akron, Ohio, where she worked at O'Neill's, which was one of the biggest and most glamorous department stores in the state. As for Donald, he proudly told people he worked at the Ohio Match Company, the world's largest producer of wooden and paper matches. And during the 41 years that the couple was married, they would live through the ups and downs of history together. The Civil Rights Movement, the first moonwalk, the Korean and Vietnam Wars, the hippie movement of the 1960s, the age of rock and roll, and the Gulf War in 1991. When Donald passed away in May of 2000 at the age of 80, Margaret, who would turn 81 that year, chose to carry on living the kind of life that she and Donald had enjoyed as a couple. Her first decision was to remain right where she was, living in the house at 359 Portage Street in Wadsworth that held so many happy memories for her and her late husband. She might not have Donald by her side anymore, but, as her nephew Howard Leisure and his wife Cindy knew, Margaret had never been a quitter, and she'd always had this wonderful appetite for life. Over the next couple of decades, Margaret, who was now a widow, spent most of her time socializing with friends or gardening or reading books or watching TV, and she also spent a lot of time watching from her front porch one procession after another of neighborhood kids growing from toddlers to teenagers. Even in 2018, when Margaret was 98 years old, she still kept busy and enjoyed good health. Despite spending more and more time inside of her home, she still cared very much about her physical appearance, she kept up with the news, and she still very much looked forward to her regularly scheduled appointments with her hairdresser. Margaret's philosophy on life was simple. The world changed, and so she needed to change right along with it. On the morning of Thursday, April 5th of 2018, Margaret woke up and made her way to the front door to collect her newspaper. When she opened the door, she saw gray clouds in the sky and felt the chilly spring air blow across her face. She could already tell she would not be spending any time outdoors that day. Her body just could not handle the cold anymore. So, after getting dressed and eating her breakfast, Margaret sat in her favorite armchair in the living room and read a book and also watched some TV. She made 2 more light meals for herself that day, taking her time after each one to wash and dry her dishes, and she also set aside a few bills and notices that she knew she would need to get to in the next couple of days. As it grew dark outside, Margaret climbed the steps to the second floor of her house and got herself ready for bed. After washing up and putting on her nightdress, she went back down the stairs and curled up on the couch to read a bit more of her book and catch a little more TV before going to sleep. A little while later, as snowflakes fell outside of her window, Margaret decided that she was so cozy right there in her warm living room that she would just sleep down there on her couch that night. After turning off the TV and setting her book on the table nearby, Margaret snuggled down into her pillow and closed her eyes. Before she actually fell asleep, it hadn't even crossed her mind to get up and go make sure the front and back doors of her house were locked. She had lived in that house for more than 70 years and had stopped locking the doors a long time ago. 3 days later, at 9 a.m. on Monday, April 9th, the Wadsworth Police Department got a call from Margaret's nephew, Howard Leisure, who lived in a town just outside of Wadsworth about 40 minutes away. Howard told police that the day before, one of Margaret's neighbors had noticed newspapers were piling up against her front door, and when he, Howard, had tried calling her, she had not picked up, and considering her age, he was concerned about her. So, police immediately sent a patrol officer to 359 Portage Street for a welfare check. When officers arrived at Margaret's house, they found the front door was unlocked, so they stepped inside the residence and called out for Margaret, but the house was silent. They began searching the property, but there was no sign of a disturbance, nor was there any sign of Margaret, except that her walker, which she took everywhere with her, was still neatly tucked behind a well-used armchair in the living room. Finally, after searching the whole house and finding nothing, the police called back to their station and filed a missing person report. Then, the police who had done the search contacted Howard and his wife to inform them of the situation and to ask them to come to Wadsworth to assist in the search for Margaret. While police waited for Howard and Cindy to arrive at the house, they spoke with some neighbors who had gathered outside, and they would tell the police that the last time they had actually physically seen Margaret was a few days earlier on Thursday, April 5th. By late afternoon, Howard and Cindy had arrived at Margaret's house, and after speaking with police, they quickly walked up the front stairs and into Margaret's home. Inside, the first thing that Howard noticed was that the small red wallet that his aunt always carried with her or left on the little table next to her favorite armchair was missing. And a few minutes later, Howard opened the small downstairs closet, thinking maybe Margaret had left the wallet inside of a coat pocket that was hung up inside of that closet. But instead of finding Margaret's clothes hung neatly on hangers like they would normally be, the closet was a jumble of clothes piled on top of his aunt's vacuum cleaner on the ground. Peeking out from the bottom of the pile, Howard spotted one of the slippers his aunt often wore. Stooping down, Howard reached out and he grabbed it. Seconds later, the police and Cindy would hear Howard let out a scream of pure horror. They ran from the living room and found Howard on the ground, recoiling in shock and pointing at the open closet in front of him. Within minutes, there were dozens of police and emergency vehicles outside of 359 Portage Street. As neighbors looked out their windows to see what was happening on an otherwise cold and quiet Monday evening, a patrol officer was already blocking off the perimeter of Margaret's property with bright yellow crime scene tape. Inside, other officers wearing gloves and crime scene gear were gathered around the open door of that tiny downstairs closet, while Howard sat in another room, his wife's arm wrapped around his shaking shoulders while she tried to comfort him. When Howard had tugged on his aunt's slipper, he he had felt a foot still inside of it. Moments later, police would discover Margaret's body, all but naked, crammed inside of this little closet underneath the pile of clothes. Her head, face down, was wedged into the back corner of the closet, while her backside was up in the air, her knees bent underneath her at a sharp angle. Margaret was deceased, and based on the condition of her body, it was obvious she had been the victim of a violent homicide. Within hours of discovering Margaret's body, investigators were combing Margaret's property looking for clues, and it wasn't long before they found their first important piece of physical evidence. It was a single food service type plastic glove with small traces of blood on it, and it looked like someone had recently dropped it in Margaret's backyard. But other than this glove, which was quickly sent off for testing, the police did not find anything else on the property that could help explain what had happened to Margaret or who was responsible for the attack. While patrol officers spread out around Margaret's neighborhood to talk with residents about any unusual activity or people in the area, detectives began considering possible motives for the crime. At first, it seemed like this had been a robbery because Margaret's red wallet was missing, but it would turn out that wallet was the only thing missing from Margaret's house, and it only contained a little bit of cash and some credit cards that had not even been used since Margaret was last spotted on Thursday, April 5th. So with robbery more or less ruled out, police began to wonder if, Margaret had enemies that might want her dead. But everyone the police spoke with said the same thing. Margaret got along with everyone. No one would want to hurt her. And so, with no obvious motive or suspect, the police simply began investigating everyone who was close to Margaret. They started with Howard and Cindy, but they were both quickly ruled out using their cell phone data. Police would also speak to other family members and friends, and they too would all be quickly ruled out as well. But when they started interviewing neighbors and former neighbors, one person stood out. His name was David Klinkenbach, and even after moving from the house next to Margaret's to a new address 2 miles away, David had continued to be the person who checked up on Margaret most frequently. He'd stop by her house a couple of times a week, and he helped take care of her weekly trash collection, moving her garbage containers to and from the street on trash day. Right after Margaret's body had been discovered, police had actually called David's home because they had been told he was close with her and so they wanted to speak to him, but he had not answered. Instead, police found him right outside of her house, pacing around chain-smoking cigarettes and telling anyone who would listen that he was very nervous about his fingerprints being all over the inside of Margaret's home. When police spoke to him, he obsessively asked them how was the investigation going so far and what had they discovered inside of the house. So, feeling very suspicious of David, the police would bring him into the station for questioning, and pretty much right away, David began looking more and more suspicious. David seemed to have information about details of Margaret's death that had not been widely shared, like where exactly in her house she had been found and what she was wearing, and when answering police questions about how well he knew Margaret, David also surprised investigators with random comments on Margaret's appearance and the fact that, especially earlier in her life, she had been a very attractive woman. But by the end of Wednesday, April 11th, so 2 days after the discovery of Margaret's body, David would be ruled out as a suspect. The DNA results from the bloody glove that had been found in Margaret's backyard had come back, and the blood on them did not belong to David, nor did it belong to anyone the police had spoken with thus far. Additionally, Margaret's autopsy had come back, and her time of death was listed as sometime around Friday, April 6th, and the data from David's cell phone showed he was not near her property at that time. So now, with the residents of Wadsworth starting to press law enforcement for answers, police were forced to regroup and take a different approach to finding out who in this quiet, pretty town would have wanted to kill a seemingly harmless 98-year-old woman. The only thing that seemed even remotely promising as another possible lead were reports from neighbors that in the weeks leading up to Margaret's death, there had been a rash of minor car break-ins. Nothing very serious, just a few car owners who had told police that their unlocked vehicles had been rifled through and small items like change and dollar bills had been taken. But these crimes of opportunity made police wonder if the perpetrator had started to check for unlocked homes as well as unlocked cars. Maybe they had tried Margaret's front door, they had found it open, and before long, what started as a robbery turned into a murder. And when police started looking right around Margaret's house to see if around the time she was killed, had there been any car break-ins or had there been any other recent reports of suspicious or possibly criminal activity, they found something. A carjacking had been reported right near Margaret's house on April 8th, so this would have been one day before Margaret's body was found. So the police tracked down the person who owned the vehicle that had been stolen. The owner was a 50-year-old church worker named Paul Shalit. Police expected this interview to be fairly simple and straightforward, but it wasn't. When police visited Paul at his house and asked him to describe what happened, he came across as very nervous and evasive. He told investigators that he had been out driving and had seen a young man, maybe 18 or 19 years old, and he apparently was limping as he was walking down the sidewalk. And so Paul, being a good Samaritan, had slowed down and asked this young man if he needed help, and the young man had said yes, he did need help. So Paul said he had pulled his SUV over to the side of the curb and he had got out to help the injured young man. But as soon as Paul had climbed out of his vehicle and had begun walking around the back of the vehicle to make his way over to the sidewalk, apparently this young man had lunged and opened the passenger side door of Paul's SUV. He had leapt across the middle console into the driver's seat and then had sped off, leaving Paul stranded. However, this story didn't really make sense to police because, according to the report, Paul's car had been found almost immediately and right down the street, totally undamaged. And after police wrapped up this first interview with Paul, they would review security footage of the carjacking that had been captured by cameras on a nearby building, and they saw firsthand that Paul's story was just not lining up. The footage of the carjacking showed that there was this young man on the sidewalk near where Paul's car slowed and stopped, but the young man was not limping, and as soon as Paul had stopped his car next to the curb, he didn't get out of the vehicle. Instead, the young man approached the passenger side of the vehicle and appeared to be speaking into the window, presumably to Paul, and then after a couple of minutes, the young man climbed into the vehicle with Paul. And then a few minutes later, Paul would suddenly jump out of the car, and the car, with the young man still inside of it, would take off down the road. So the police went back to Paul's house to question him again, and when confronted with the security footage of the carjacking, Paul would eventually tell police the truth. It would turn out the carjacking actually started as an encounter that Paul had set up using the social networking site Grindr that caters to people who identify as gay, bi, trans, and queer. According to Paul, he and the young man had met as planned and had begun a sexual encounter inside of Paul's SUV. But then, according to Paul, the young man, quote, snapped. And then a few moments later, the young man had overpowered Paul, forcing him out of the car onto the road, and then the young man sped off, leaving Paul standing there in the middle of the street. And then when the car was recovered later that day down the road, the young man was not found. When asked by detectives to provide contact information for this young man/carjacker, Paul would tell them that he was so embarrassed about what had happened that he had actually deleted all remnants of this young man from his phone. Meaning he had completely deleted his Grindr account and so could not recover it, and he also had deleted the contact information for this young man that he had stored directly on his phone. So with no way of finding or identifying this carjacker, the police were forced to just wait and hope this mystery carjacker eventually turned up. A few days later, on Friday, April 13th, roughly 1 week after Margaret was killed, the Wadsworth police got a call from a local construction site reporting that someone had broken into one of their trailers. When investigators arrived at the scene of the break-in, the first thing they did was search the area. And behind the trailer that had been broken into was a cell phone lying in the dirt. The police would quickly unlock the phone and discover that its owner was a teenage boy whose name was already very familiar to Wadsworth police, Zach Thronson. Zach was a troubled young man who had previously gotten in trouble for petty theft as well as breaking into people's cars. And so naturally, the police thought Zach not only must have robbed this construction site, but almost certainly had to be the mystery carjacker they were looking for. And if that was true, maybe Zach had something to do with Margaret's murder. When police tracked Zach down, they found him asleep in his car in the parking lot at a local high school, and when they looked in the driver's window at him, police immediately noticed that his knees were all cut up, and these cuts looked recent. Waking up to see police tapping on his car window, Zach was nervous as well as startled, but he quickly agreed to come into the police station to answer a few questions. Initially, Zach denied that he had anything to do with the break-in at the construction site, but once police showed him his cell phone and they told him where they had found it, Zach's shoulders slumped and his head fell forward as he gripped his knees, and he took a deep breath as he stared at the floor, and then when he looked up again at the detectives, Zach sighed and said, "Okay, yes, I was at the construction site last night." But when investigators asked him if he had also committed the carjacking 5 days earlier, Zach seemed to perk up and said, "No, I really have no idea about that. I definitely did not steal anyone's car." And when police dug into this and really put him on the spot about it because they didn't really believe him, Zach stuck to his story and said, "Look, I've committed other robberies, but not this one." The police eventually believed him and just asked him point blank, "Okay, well, did you have anything to do with Margaret's murder?" And at this, Zach became extremely emphatic that of course he had heard about the murder, everyone had, but no way. He had nothing to do with that. By this point, Zach was totally rattled by the seriousness of the questions he was being asked. And so, likely just as a way of making himself seem a little bit less guilty and less suspicious, Zach started to throw his 17-year-old friend, Gavin Ramsey, under the bus. Zach said that Gavin had not only participated in every crime that Zach had, including the construction site break-in the night before, but also Gavin was the mastermind behind all of the crimes. And so if the police were thinking a local criminal had anything to do with the murder, well, they shouldn't talk to Zach, they should talk to Gavin. And the police would do just that. And when Gavin came to the police station, he did not arrive alone. Sitting next to him in the interrogation room was his mother, Christine. Gavin was the second oldest of her 4 sons, and she knew he was a troublemaker. Over the last 10 years, she had on several occasions enrolled her son in counseling, but she wasn't really sure if it was having an effect. It wasn't long into Gavin's interview before Gavin, like Zach, admitted that he had done some small stuff. He'd taken a little money from some cars recently, and he'd probably been the subject of a few noise complaints from neighbors, but that was it. When he was told that his friend Zach had placed him at the scene of the much more serious crime of breaking into the trailer at the construction site, Gavin hung his head momentarily, but then looked up and said, "Okay, yes, I was involved in that incident too." But when investigators asked Gavin if he had been involved in the carjacking on April 8th, Gavin's demeanor completely changed. He'd seemed almost comfortable talking about the petty theft and even the construction site break-in. But at the mention of this carjacking, he suddenly began shifting in his chair and he leaned forward and he put his face in his hands. Gavin wasn't the only person in the room to have a strong reaction. After hearing about this carjacking, Gavin's mom looked at her son and said, "Carjacking? Really?" But once detectives began describing some of the details of the carjacking, how it had started with a sexual encounter between the carjacker and the victim, Paul, Christine suddenly became far less worried that her son had potentially committed a carjacking, and now was just worried that he had been potentially sexually assaulted during the carjacking. It was at this point, when his mother was really starting to get upset, that Gavin actually asked one of the investigators if he could just speak to them alone for a few minutes. And so, reluctantly, his mother and a patrol officer who had been in the room as well would leave the room, and then once Gavin was alone with the detectives, he would admit that, yes, he was the mystery carjacker. However, he wanted to correct a detail about that story, and he didn't want his mother to hear it. He told the detectives that he had agreed to meet Paul that night, but Gavin was not there to have sex with him. Instead, he had created a fake profile on Grindr to lure a gay man into meeting him so that he could rob them, and Paul was just the guy who had agreed to meet up. As far as Gavin was concerned, any man agreeing to meet a young man like him deserved whatever they got. When police felt satisfied that they had all the information they could get about the carjacking, they asked Gavin point blank if he had anything to do with Margaret's murder. And Gavin was just as adamant as his friend Zach that of course he knew about the murder. Everybody did, but he had nothing to do with it. The carjacking was his worst crime. Eventually, the detectives felt like they had gotten all the information they could from Gavin, and so they called his mother back into the room so they could release him. When she came back inside, the police told her that she and her son were free to leave for now, but before they left, the police would like to have a look at Gavin's cell phone. There was some information on there that could confirm some of the things he had told them, and so could she, his guardian, sign a consent form allowing them to do that. Gavin did not like this idea, but his mother did. She signed the form, and then moments later, the police had Gavin's phone, and the teenager and his mother were walking out of the station. A few hours later, the police would unlock Gavin's phone, and they would somewhat unintentionally discover something that shocked them to their core. Based on what they found on Gavin's phone, and on evidence that police would uncover over the next 72 hours following their conversation with Gavin, here is a reconstruction of what happened to 98-year-old Margaret Douglas on the day she died, April 6, 2018. At about 2 a.m. in the early morning hours of Friday, April 6th, Margaret's murderer walked the short distance from his house to her house. The temperature outside had dropped to about 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was snowing lightly. Margaret's street was a quiet one, each house separated from the curb by a wide strip of grass and a sidewalk, each house separated from its neighbor by a driveway leading to a detached garage. As the murderer reached the edge of Margaret's property, he looked in all directions to make sure no one was watching him, and then he quickly slipped down her driveway around to her backyard. Once there, he stepped up to the back door and peered through the glass. Inside, he could just make out the gleam of the metal sink set into the counter on the kitchen wall opposite him. Then he quietly turned the knob with a gloved hand. As he had hoped, the door was open, and a moment later, the intruder had stepped inside, out of the falling snow and the chilly air. After pausing for a minute to let his hands warm up and to look around and get his bearings, the intruder pulled his cell phone out of his pocket. He tapped the screen and entered his password, then he opened his camera and began taking a video. With his phone out in front of him recording, he began walking noiselessly through the kitchen toward the dining room. As he walked, the camera picked up how dimly lit the house was, with the only lights being from a few night lights and from street lights shining in through uncurtained windows. With the camera still rolling, he walked through the dining room and into the cozy living room in the front of the house. And there, fast asleep on her favorite sofa, was Margaret. She was dressed in slippers, a nightgown, and robe, her white hair arranged in short, neat curls around her face. The intruder stood there quietly for a few minutes, just drinking in the sight of her through the lens of his camera. Then, moving soundlessly around the blue-carpeted room, he began taking a series of videos of Margaret from different angles and different vantage points, listening all the while to her gentle, steady breathing. He felt a rush of excitement as he imagined the moment when he would wake her up and she would see him standing there in her house in the dark for the first time. With that thought in mind, now standing off to the side behind a nearby armchair, the intruder made his first deliberate noise. A cough. He heard the rustle of fabric, and then, through the camera viewfinder of his phone, he saw Margaret wake up. Staring ahead out into the darkness of her familiar living room, Margaret seemed instantly aware that suddenly she was not alone. The camera picked up her scratchy whisper. "Is someone there?" As she turned her head in his direction, the intruder stepped out of his hiding place. As he did, his camera caught an image of Margaret's face, the look of shock and fear as she realized that she'd been right, that she wasn't alone, that someone was in the room with her. But before Margaret could raise herself from the couch, the intruder stepped closer to her. He wished there was some way to capture what he was about to do to her on camera, but for what he was about to do, he knew he needed two hands. And so he turned off his camera, he slipped his phone into his pocket, and then with both of his hands, he reached down and he grabbed Margaret and he pulled her off the couch and dumped her on the ground on her back. And then he stepped on top of her and then crouched down, straddling her chest, and then he reached down and he put two hands around her neck and he began to squeeze. He knew there were many other ways to kill someone, but he didn't want to use a weapon that would put distance between him and his victim. He wanted to be there up close when they died. He wanted to feel them when they died. And so with his hands wrapped around her neck, he began squeezing harder and harder and harder, and as he did, Margaret began to fight back. Even at 98 years old, Margaret was still strong and sturdy, her hands reaching up to pull his fingers away as she rolled from side to side, trying to get out from under her attacker. But he was just too strong, and he kept squeezing harder and harder. As soon as Margaret started to go limp from a lack of oxygen, the killer released her neck. Barely alive and barely breathing, Margaret had no strength left to try to get away, so she just laid there on her back, still. As she did, her killer, who was still straddling her chest, looked down at her with immense pleasure. Then he balled each of his gloved hands into fists and began punching her face over and over and over again. It was only after it was obvious that Margaret was already dead that her murderer finally leaned back and let his arms drop to his sides while he tried to catch his breath. Once his heart rate had slowed, Margaret's killer got back up onto his feet, and then he dug his phone back out of his pocket. He removed most of Margaret's clothing and arranged her in various suggestive poses, taking more pictures and videos as he went, and finally taking a video of himself sexually abusing her corpse. It was almost 4 a.m. when the murderer finally noticed the time. He had been in Margaret's house now for 2 hours, and he needed to be back at his own house before 5 a.m. But before he could leave, he needed to hide all the evidence that he had been there, and that meant hiding Margaret's body. Looking around the room, he spotted a small closet just to the right of the front door. Dragging her body across the room, he opened the closet door, and pushing and shoving, he finally managed to cram her body into the tiny space. After covering her with clothes and the vacuum cleaner, the murderer shut the door on her. Before leaving, the killer looked around the house one more time and noticed Margaret's bright red wallet sitting on an end table. Moving quickly now, he stepped over to the table, he pocketed the wallet, and then he headed for the back door of the house. Once outside again, the killer pulled off his blood-smeared plastic gloves and stuffed them inside of his jacket pockets. Just a few minutes later, the murderer was slipping quietly back into his own bedroom, just 5 houses away. What he didn't realize is that one of his bloody gloves that he had stuffed into his pockets had actually fallen out and was now laying in Margaret's backyard. 1 week later, on Friday, April 13th, after Gavin and his mother had left the police station, Wadsworth police would unlock Gavin's cell phone, and as they began looking through it, they found a folder labeled Dark. And in this folder were all the horrific videos and pictures taken of Margaret and her home on the night she was killed. The person who took those pictures and those videos, and who killed Margaret, was 17-year-old Gavin Ramsey. 3 days later, on April 16th, Wadsworth police arrested Gavin and charged him with the murder. Inside Gavin's bedroom, investigators would find the other plastic glove that matched the one dropped at the crime scene, and forensic tests on both gloves would show that the DNA and bodily fluids on the gloves matched Gavin's. Police also found Margaret's red wallet, along with notebooks belonging to Gavin that detailed his desire to kill, along with his detailed handwritten research into the crimes and methods of famous serial killers. Digging into Gavin's personal history, investigators also discovered that in the year preceding Margaret's murder, Gavin had applied for work at a local funeral home. This fact would be significant in light of a later court-ordered psychiatric report that showed that Gavin found sex with corpses exciting. Police theorized that Gavin, who had once gone to Margaret's house to ask if he could help her out with some yard work, which she didn't hire him for, chose Margaret as his victim because of her advanced age and lack of home security. In November 2018, 7 months after Margaret's murder, Ohio state prosecutors won a legal ruling that would allow the videos and images from Gavin's cell phone to be used as evidence against him in a public trial where Gavin would be charged as an adult. In response to this ruling, Gavin avoided a public trial by pleading no contest to 9 charges that included aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, kidnapping, and gross abuse of a corpse. Although Gavin's mother, Christine, told the judge at a sentencing hearing on January 4, 2019, that Gavin's aggressive behavior and poor judgment were caused by his pediatrician misprescribing the antidepressant Zoloft that Gavin was taking at the time of the murder, the judge ultimately sentenced Gavin to life in prison at Grafton Correctional Institution, an adult facility located 40 minutes to the northwest of Wadsworth. On Monday, April 16th, the same day that Gavin was arrested and charged with the murder, 98-year-old Margaret Douglas was laid to rest right beside her husband Donald on a quiet grassy slope in the Ohio Western Reserve National Cemetery. On her headstone, it just reads, "In God's hands, in our hearts." Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, Please invite the 5-star review button to come on over for a fun pizza party, but when they get there, only serve fermented herring. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on all platforms is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In the early morning hours of Saturday, October 30th, 2004, a man walked out of his suburban Virginia home and started walking down his driveway to get the newspaper. This was one of the man's favorite times of the day, when just for a few minutes, it felt like he was the only person in the world who was outside. It was like everybody else was still sleeping. However, that morning, he was wrong. He was not alone. Someone was hiding nearby, and they were watching him and waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, when the 5-star review button comes into your store at the mall, only pretend to validate their parking ticket when they hand it to you. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. "52-year-old Fred Jablin watched with pride as his 3 children filed ahead of him into Temple Beth Ahaba's Friday evening service. The night, October 29th, 2004, was cloudy and cool, and in Richmond, the capital city of Virginia, the maples and oak trees were still decked out with red and gold fall foliage. Even in the twilight darkness, the autumn colors glowed around the synagogue, the oldest Jewish house of worship in the city of almost 200,000 residents. Just the sight of Beth Ahaba and the graceful columns that fronted the stone and brick building always made Fred feel better, a little less anxious and a little less worried. And every time he walked past the familiar plaque outside the temple and read the words, quote, "What doth the Lord require of thee? Justice, mercy, humility," Fred reminded himself that those 3 qualities had already helped him get through the worst years of his life. And he believed now that those same 3 qualities, justice, mercy, humility, would help guide him and his son and 2 daughters into a happier future. As the Jablins took their usual seats and exchanged quiet greetings with friends and acquaintances, Fred did what he always did. He made a point of reflecting on just how important religion, community, friendship, and the support of his colleagues at work were to his life and his family. And the power of gratitude was just one of the very hard lessons Fred had learned during the last 5 years, when the cracks in his marriage of almost 2 decades had become too deep to patch up. As a well-known and highly regarded college professor who had been one of the early pioneers in the field of organizational communication, Fred had truly believed 5 years ago, back in 1999, that he and his ex-wife, Piper Roundtree, could work together to resolve their differences. But that was before he had found out about his wife's affair with a local doctor. And while that affair was the tipping point for Fred's decision to file for divorce the next year, in March of 2001, that affair had really just been the final betrayal in a series of events that still had the power to shock him, even now, 2 years after he and Piper had officially ended their marriage. As Fred settled into his seat and prepared for the Shabbat, the service that would celebrate God's creation of the world and mark the beginning of a 24-hour period of rest and reflection, he thought how close he had come to losing his job and to losing the trust and respect of his neighbors and coworkers. In the terrible lead-up to the divorce, Piper's behavior had become more and more erratic. The medications she was taking for depression and attention deficit disorder did not seem to be enough to stabilize her moods or decrease her sense of anxiety or discontent. But it wasn't until Piper began calling police and reporting that Fred was physically abusing her and accusing him of trying to drug her that Fred had finally understood just how broken their relationship really was. By then, they had already tried marriage counseling, and Piper had moved out of their family house several times to stay with her best friend in Richmond. But even then, somehow Piper and Fred had still managed to limp along, despite the difficulty Piper had in holding a job, despite the fact that she had a law degree, and her increasing unreliability in caring for the kids, even after she chose to stay at home rather than work outside of the house. But then came the afternoon 4 years ago when police arrived at the University of Richmond where Fred had a tenured teaching position. Earlier that day, Piper had gone to the Henrico County Magistrate's office and sworn out an arrest warrant and restraining order against her husband. Of course, it hadn't always been that way. Back when Fred, an up-and-coming professor, and Piper, a student in her final year, met back in 1981 at the University of Texas in Austin, they seemed to have exactly nothing in common. And when Fred, who was 8 years older than Piper, first met Piper through another professor, Fred did not even recognize her as one of the many students who had attended one of Fred's classes the year before. While 21-year-old Piper was one of 5 children from an old Texas family that had lived in Harlingen, a small town just 30 miles north of the Mexico border, 29-year-old Fred was one of 2 brothers who were born and raised in a mostly Jewish working-class neighborhood just 20 miles east of New York City. While Piper was hands down beautiful, with her dark hair and dark eyes and petite but athletic build, Fred was thin and balding and completely average-looking, except for the intelligent eyes and the playful grin that clued people in to his wry and entertaining sense of humor. And their outlook on the world turned out to be just as different as their appearances. Fred was a great believer in rational thinking, and where he viewed the world in terms of black and white and took great comfort in set routines, Piper was a free spirit who loved to paint and who would, over time, fill the couple's house with adopted and rescued animals, from birds to a pet ferret. But 2 years after their first meeting, Fred and Piper were married, and over the next 6 years, Piper would eventually get her law degree, cycle in and out of 2 jobs, and then give birth to their oldest child, their daughter Jocelyn. Their son Paxton would arrive 3 years later, and their youngest, Callie, would arrive 3 years after that. And for a long time, it seemed like Fred and Piper's differences actually brought out the best in each of them. Fred became less rigid in his thinking, and Piper seemed to blossom in the light of Fred's affection and devotion to her and the children. But over time, the charm of their opposite personalities seemed to wear very thin. Fred was never a big fan of Piper's family and took to skipping Piper's family reunions. For her part, Piper didn't really connect with Fred's family either, and when his parents died, she opted not to go to either of their funerals. But when Fred got the job offer from the University of Richmond, which came with a $30,000 a year bump in pay, both Piper and Fred agreed that, financially at least, the move from Texas to Virginia made all kinds of sense for their family. The extra money meant that Piper did not have to worry about working if she didn't want to, and she could hire a cleaning service to take care of the house, along with a nanny who could help with the kids. And at first, Fred was sure that the move had given all of them a fresh start. But by 1995, 12 years after they had gotten married, and just 1 year after their move from Texas to Virginia, Fred and Piper were seeing a marriage counselor. Piper was just not able to pass the Virginia bar exam. That's the test that would have allowed her to practice law in Virginia. And even though she had been reluctant to leave her close-knit family in Texas, Piper was not prepared for just how much she missed her mother and siblings. Particularly her older sister Tina, who had always been available to help babysit the kids and to take Piper's side in any of the complaints Piper had about Fred. Prone to postpartum depression, the arrival of the Roundtree-Jablin's third baby a year after the move to Virginia seemed to send Piper into a tailspin. But even therapy, both marriage counseling and private therapy with a psychiatrist, did not stop Piper from racking up nearly $52,000 in credit card debt any more than it would reverse the couple's slide into divorce a few years later. But still, nothing in those rocky years could have prepared Fred for that afternoon when Piper had orchestrated his arrest on that charge of domestic violence. Even now, sitting inside the place of worship he had returned to after the divorce, Fred could feel the shame and stunned surprise he felt as he left his office under police escort, hearing the whispers of students and seeing the shock on the faces of his colleagues. But maybe that was exactly what Fred had needed in order to accept that he and his children were probably better off without Piper. So, immediately after being released from the police station that day, Fred had obeyed the terms of the restraining order and kept his distance from Piper by moving into a motel not far from Richmond University, but he also wasted no time in hiring an attorney, and 1 month later, Fred appeared in juvenile court and argued successfully that the Roundtree-Jablin children were not safe with Piper. And when the judge examined the evidence of Piper's erratic behavior, the times when she had simply forgotten to pick the children up from school or other activities, and the complete lack of evidence that Piper was a victim of domestic violence, the judge granted Fred temporary custody of Jocelyn, Paxton, and Callie. Until that moment, Fred had believed that the love he and Piper shared for their 3 kids might be enough of a foundation for them to have a civil divorce. Instead, the children became the battlefield for a bitter custody fight. In the end, the court had not believed any of Piper's charges of abuse, and when Fred had filed for divorce, he did so on the grounds that Piper had been unfaithful. He had cited Piper's affair with their oldest daughter's doctor, although it would turn out that there had been other men too, maybe even going back to the mid-1990s. And there was nothing quick or easy about how they reached a settlement. Piper had repeatedly asked for delays in the divorce proceedings until finally, in 2002, almost a year to the date after Fred had filed for the divorce, when Piper did not show up for a hearing on finances and custody, the judge went ahead and made a final ruling without her. And that ruling would turn out to be absolutely devastating for the one-time stay-at-home mom, because on all fronts, Piper would wind up losing. According to that judgment, Fred, whose money had been used to purchase their house in Texas and their house in Virginia, and whose retirement account was much larger than Piper's, would get nearly all the couple's property and liquid assets. But it was the judgment on custody that would completely sever the bond between the parents, because when Fred would eventually press for full legal and physical custody, the court sided with him. That meant that Piper would need to go through Fred to make any and all arrangements to visit their 3 kids. And as far as support payments went, citing Piper's potential as an attorney to out-earn Fred's own salary as a professor, the court also agreed that Fred no longer needed to pay Piper support money, and that going forward, it was Piper who would need to get a job and pay Fred $890 in child support every month. Fred had had no illusions that Piper would actually make those payments, at least not on a monthly basis. And he was right. Piper had tried twice to declare bankruptcy as a way of setting aside the whole divorce decree until a federal bankruptcy court actually prevented her from filing a 3rd time. But Piper's new financial obligations did mean that in order to practice law, she would need to move 1,200 miles away back to Texas, where she had passed that state's bar exam and could practice law. But even though Piper had been the loser in the battle over custody, she had found ways to strike back at Fred. And when it came to revenge, Piper had a lot of help from her sister Tina. And just thinking of Tina made Fred's body tense. Immediately following the court ruling on child support and custody, Tina had written a 43-page so-called psychological profile of Fred. A nurse practitioner who ran her own women's healthcare clinic, Tina was not a licensed mental health professional. But that did not stop her from attacking every aspect of Fred's character, personality, and temperament. In the report, Tina accused Fred of physical and sexual assault, drug abuse, and various personality disorders. She also warned parents that any child or minor that Fred had contact with was at risk of being psychologically abused. Describing the report as a, quote, court document, so it sounded very official, Piper then emailed her sister's denunciation of Fred to his coworkers and university administration, as well as to members of the Parent-Teachers Association at the schools the children all went to, and to the leaders of the scout clubs the kids attended, and to the list of friends and acquaintances Fred and Piper had once shared. During that especially dark period, when the divorce and the pain was so raw that Fred questioned if life could ever seem normal again, he had wondered who hated him more, his ex-wife Piper or his ex-sister-in-law Tina. Just the thought of that question made Fred doubly relieved that he had changed his will just this last year so that in the event of his death, custody of his kids, along with the control over the financial assets his kids would inherit, would go to his brother, Michael, who lived with his wife and their 2 kids in Northern Virginia. Fred had also installed a home security system just in case. He'd never forgotten the time when Piper had taken their youngest child and disappeared without telling Fred, only to turn up in Texas at her sister Tina's with a story of how Fred had started trying to drug Piper. In fact, it had been the other way around. After Fred and Piper split, Fred had learned from a neighbor that Piper had confessed to spiking Fred's morning coffee with the antidepressant Prozac. Fred was suddenly brought back to the present by a gentle nudge from his 15-year-old daughter, Jocelyn. And he realized with a start that he had spent the last several minutes just going through the motions of the Friday evening service. He thought again of the plaque outside the temple, that what the Lord asked of him was justice, mercy, and humility. Fred was self-aware enough to know that when he and Piper divorced 2 years ago, he was thinking more of justice than he was of mercy or humility. But now, 2 years after the divorce agreement was signed, it seemed like both he and Piper had reached a much better place, both as a divorced couple and as individuals. It had taken Fred a while, but he had grown into his all-consuming role as single dad, and all 3 kids were doing exceptionally well. He loved taking the kids to their after-school and summer activities. They had become close to their uncle, Fred's brother Michael, and just 5 months earlier, Fred had ventured out into the dating world and had begun a promising relationship with another single parent, a down-to-earth woman named Charlene. As for Piper, she had begun dating soon after returning to Texas, where she now lived in Houston, very close to her sister Tina. Piper had her own small law practice, but made most of her income doing research into land titles. It was steady work that did not require a law degree, and it paid well enough that she had been able to afford a house of her own, a new black Liberty Jeep, and a lifestyle that seemed comfortable and secure. Even though Piper was often behind on child support, Fred was accommodating about any plans Piper could make to see their kids. In fact, just a few weeks earlier, Piper had come east and taken all 3 kids on a long weekend camping trip in one of Virginia's beautiful national forests. And even though her in-person visits with the kids were not as long or as many as Piper wanted, it wasn't unusual for her to call the kids more than once a day. Maybe, Fred thought as he gave Jocelyn a nudge back to show her he was paying attention again, maybe he and Piper both were ready to practice mercy and humility. Back at the Jablin house on Hearthglow Lane, Fred pulled into the driveway of the detached 2-car garage. A moment later, the children piled out of the Ford Explorer and made their way inside the handsome brick and wood 2-story house set on a slight rise and surrounded by stately trees. Halloween had always been Fred's favorite holiday, and he and the kids had bagged up most of the fallen leaves and stuffed them into leaf bags that were the shape and color of carved orange pumpkins. Throughout the quiet and affluent subdivision, with its neat green and white welcome sign that read Kingsley, homemade scarecrows and ghosts made out of white sheets watched over the comfortable homes, all set back from the road, some with living rooms and kitchen lights shining through the windows. Once inside 1515 Hearthglow Lane, Fred wasted no time shepherding the 3 children off to bed. It was around 10 p.m. when he had said his final goodnight and headed back downstairs to clean up and give Charlene a call before heading to bed himself. By the time Fred had switched off his bedside light and settled down to sleep, the painful memories of the past had been replaced with a sense of pleasant anticipation for the weekend ahead. tomorrow was Saturday, and while the children slept in, Fred would enjoy his coffee and newspaper, and after that, all four of them would have a busy day, going to the annual neighborhood pumpkin festival, spending time together and with friends, and putting the finishing touches on their costumes. And on Sunday, they would all enjoy the kind of safe scares that came with going door-to-door trick-or-treating. At 6:37 a.m. the next morning, Fred Jablin's next-door neighbors awoke from a deep sleep to the sudden sound of 3 gunshots. Getting out of bed and stepping to the open window, former Marine Bob McCardle pushed aside the curtain and saw a shadowy figure running across his front yard and then disappearing into neighboring house lots. While dogs began barking and other neighbors were wondering if a car had backfired or if a hunter was shooting ducks down on Tuckahoe Creek, Bob immediately picked up the phone and called 911. Within minutes of the call, 3 officers from Henrico County Police Department were climbing out of the patrol car in front of the McCardle home. Spreading out across the lawns of Hearthglow Lane, they used flashlights to search in the darkness for the source of the disturbance. But after 20 minutes, the officers reported back to Bob that they had not found anything suspicious. Bob told them that once it was light, he and his wife would take their dog out for a walk, and if they saw anything that could explain the shots, they would follow up with another call to police. 25 minutes later, it was Doreen McCardle who called 911. Trying her best to keep the panic out of her voice, she explained to dispatch that she, her husband Bob, and their dog were now standing outside of their neighbor's house at 1515 Hearthglow Lane, and Bob had just discovered the body of Fred Jablin. The single dad and prominent Richmond University professor was lying in his driveway alongside the family car, his body stretched out on a thin carpet of blood-soaked leaves. This time, Henrico police responded with a flood of emergency and medical personnel, and within minutes, the quiet neighborhood was alive with flashing lights and sirens. But their response was too late. Fred Jablin was dead. Even as officers strung yellow crime scene tape around the half-acre lot of the Jablin home, a SWAT team had entered the house to make sure the murderer was not inside, and if necessary, to rescue the 3 sleeping children. But the house was empty except for Fred's kids. As Jocelyn was escorted out the back door so she would not see her father's body lying in the driveway, the 15-year-old turned to the police officer at her side, and she asked him to please make sure her brother, sister, and father got out. By 8:30 a.m. that Saturday morning, Henrico County homicide investigator Kobe Kelly had arrived on the scene and pushed the investigation into high gear. A 4-year veteran of the police force, the 6-foot 2-inch tall detective was just 32 years old, but he had a well-deserved reputation for professionalism and for getting results. The Roundtree Jablin children were quickly sheltered at the home of a local police officer who knew the Jablins and lived in the same area. A special victims unit was on its way to help break the terrible news of their father's death and to find out what the children may have heard or seen that morning. Detective Kelly's initial examination of both the outside crime scene and the inside of the house showed no evidence that this had been a robbery gone wrong. There was no sign that anything had been taken. And unfortunately, the neighbor who had made the 911 call to police after hearing gunshots and seeing a figure run across his front lawn could not even identify whether that person had been a man or a woman. Hopefully, the crime scene techs, who were already there collecting any physical evidence and dusting for fingerprints, would be able to provide more information. But at first glance, it looked to Kelly like this had been a premeditated crime, planned by someone who must have known Fred Jablin's morning routine well enough to be lying in wait for him when he stepped outside in the dark that morning to pick up the newspaper that had been tossed onto his driveway. But even before Kelly heard back from the officers he'd sent out to knock on doors and collect information and search for the murder weapon, Kelly knew that there would be plenty of suspects in this case. The victim had been a high-profile college professor with a reputation for working closely with students, any one of whom might have harbored a grudge related to perhaps a failed thesis or maybe a bad grade. With that in mind, Detective Kelly also sent a team out to the University of Richmond, 6 miles east, to treat Fred's personal office as a crime scene and to interview faculty and students. The detective also started the process of obtaining search warrants, putting in a subpoena for any relevant phone records. But even as the investigator watched a crime scene tech carefully bag a copper-jacketed hollow-point bullet they'd found to the right of the body, Detective Kelly already had the name of the person he was most interested in talking to. In any homicide investigation, the most likely suspects are those with the closest and most intense relationships to the victim. And even though Fred Jablin's ex-wife, Piper Roundtree, lived 1,200 miles to the west in Houston, Texas, she was still number one on Detective Kelly's suspect list, especially when he heard from the first officers on the scene that Fred and Piper had gone through a very messy divorce just 2 years earlier, and that custody of the 3 kids was still an ongoing issue. By 10 a.m. that morning, the oldest of the Roundtree-Jablin children had told police that she had heard a gunshot early that morning but had gone back to sleep. The younger 2 kids both told police that they had each had separate phone conversations with their mom the afternoon and evening before. She told them she was calling from Galveston, Texas, where she was researching a land title. She'd also told 12-year-old Paxton about a raccoon that was living under the porch of her house. Knowing that the first 48 hours of any investigation are often the most crucial, Detective Kelly was determined to check out every possible lead. And even though Piper had told her children she had called last night from Texas, Detective Kelly still ordered investigators to check for any passengers named Piper Roundtree who may have flown into Richmond from Houston, Texas over the last several days. By 2:30 p.m., Michael Jablin had been informed of his brother's death, and he and his wife were in their car traveling south to Richmond. And by 3:30 p.m., just 8 hours after the McCardles had discovered Fred's body and made their second 911 call, Detective Kelly had already caught a major break in the investigation. His investigators had in fact discovered that a passenger by the name of Roundtree had flown out of Virginia's Norfolk Airport just 3 hours earlier on a Southwest Airlines flight that was due to arrive back in Houston's Hobby Airport at 4:30 Houston time, which meant 5:30 Virginia time. But there was one problem. The passenger's first name was not Piper. Instead, it was a name Detective Kelly had not yet heard: Tina. Detective Kelly had already found a good picture of Piper Roundtree in one of her children's bedrooms, and the driver's license picture on file for the plane ticket his investigators had discovered was definitely a different person. Instead of dark brown hair, Tina Roundtree had shoulder-length blonde hair. Glancing at his watch and seeing he had 2 hours before the plane carrying Tina Roundtree was due to arrive at Hobby Airport in Houston, Detective Kelly rolled into action. Contacting police in Houston, he sent them pictures of both Piper and Tina Roundtree and asked them if they would go to Hobby Airport in time to locate a passenger getting off that Southwest Airlines flight who looked like either of the 2 women. But it would turn out that Detective Kelly was now in for a series of disappointments. Whoever that passenger named Tina Roundtree was, she had managed to disembark, collect her checked bags, and apparently leave the airport in Houston without being intercepted or recognized by Houston police. And when Officer Kelly finally reached Piper Roundtree by phone in Houston that night at 9 p.m., 14 hours after Fred had been declared dead, it would turn out that Piper Roundtree would have a rock-solid alibi for the time of the murder. And after being informed by a friend in Richmond about Fred's murder that morning, the only thing Piper wanted to talk about now was where her children were, who was taking care of them, and how they were coping with this devastating news. By now, Detective Kelly had also been filled in on the identity of Tina Roundtree, Piper's older sister, who also lived in Houston. Realizing that he would need to conduct this investigation in 2 different states, Detective Kelly and his partner headed to Houston to interview the Roundtree sisters. Before leaving, the lead investigator assigned Detective Chuck Hanna and one other investigator to follow up on leads in Richmond. At Detective Kelly's first official interview with Piper on Sunday, October 31st, Fred's ex-wife denied any involvement in Fred's murder. And not only would a friend of hers, who was also a lawyer, place Piper in his office before that Southwest flight ever arrived back in Houston on Saturday, October 30th, the day Fred was killed, Piper would also be able to locate someone who could provide further confirmation of her alibi, a stranger who had seen her at a local bar in Houston on Friday night, when the passenger flying under the name Tina Roundtree had already landed 1,200 miles away in Richmond, Virginia. As for Piper's sister, Tina Roundtree, where Piper had reacted to the news of Fred's death by wanting to talk about when she could see her kids again, Tina had reacted to the news by being aggressive in her criticism of Fred. She held nothing back when it came to listing his faults as a father, a husband, and a human being. But even though the hatred Tina expressed was strong enough to constitute a possible motive for Fred's murder, Tina, who had been seen at her health clinic over the weekend, also had an alibi for the Friday night before Fred's murder and the Saturday morning when he was found dead by his neighbors. And both sisters pointed to alternative suspects that were much closer to 1515 Hearthglow Lane than Texas was. First on that list was Michael Jablin, the brother who stood to gain control of Fred's financial assets. And what about Fred's latest love interest? Had police interviewed Charlene yet? And finally, without providing any names, Piper also hinted darkly at enemies Fred had within the University of Richmond. And when Virginia investigators dug deeper into the money trail behind the passenger tickets belonging to the still unidentified person who traveled under the name Tina Roundtree, the case only got more confusing. The airplane tickets had been purchased by Piper's former boyfriend on a credit card he said he hadn't used in weeks and had assumed was lost. And when investigators in Richmond found a reservation under the name Tina Roundtree at a motel in Richmond for the night before Fred's murder, the name of the person who actually checked into that room showed up in the motel records as Geraldine Smith. And drifting in the background behind the Roundtree sisters, there was Tina's on-again, off-again boyfriend who had recently taken Piper off to a shooting range for some target practice. Meanwhile, both Piper and her sister Tina started ducking out on any more interviews with law enforcement. Instead, the two sisters checked into the expensive and stylish Houstonian Hotel in central Houston. The only thing Piper seemed to care about now was arranging a court hearing in Virginia to get custody of her 3 kids. And Tina, who had appointed herself as Piper's guardian and champion, was there to support Piper and keep the press and police at bay. So despite a promising start, 3 days after the Virginia police had arrived in Houston, Texas, progress into Fred Jablin's murder came to a stuttering halt. And even though detectives in Richmond had turned up some promising evidence, what police needed was someone who could positively identify the airline passenger who went by the name Tina Roundtree and then place that person in Richmond at the time of Fred's murder. And on Wednesday, November 3rd, 5 days after Fred Jablin was killed, police finally got the tip they needed to break the case. Based on an interview with a Southwest Airlines ticketing agent and the deconstruction of hundreds of cell phone calls placed during the days before and after Fred Jablin's death, here is a reconstruction of what happened outside of 1515 Hearthglow Lane on the morning of Saturday, October 30th, 2004. Anyone who knew Frederick Mark Jablin also knew he was a man who enjoyed his routines, especially after all the disruptions of the last 2 years. He found new meaning in simple pleasures, like getting up at the same time every morning, retrieving his newspaper from the side driveway, then enjoying a freshly brewed pot of coffee in his quiet kitchen. And on this Saturday, when Fred stepped outside dressed in his navy blue sweatpants, sweatshirt, and robe, he also enjoyed knowing that he and the kids could spend the day together, getting ready for Halloween. When he and Piper were together, it had been Fred who took the family pictures, even though it meant that he himself was rarely in any of them. This year, he would make sure to have his neighbors take pictures of him and the 3 kids. It had been a long haul getting through the divorce, but despite the painful memories that had preoccupied him last night during the Friday evening service at Temple Beth Ahaba, the fact was that Fred felt pretty good about his life and about his kids. He and Piper might not see eye to eye, and Fred doubted he'd ever fully trust his ex-wife again, but he knew she loved their kids as deeply as he did. As Fred headed slowly for the driveway, he could see the tall trees that ringed the big backyard and feel the chill air on his face and ankles. This time tomorrow, daylight savings time would come to an end and clocks would have been set back an hour. Instead of darkness, he'd be watching the sun rise. Still, he liked this feeling of being all alone, the only person awake and outside. Except that Fred was not alone. Standing quietly in the shadow on the far side of the garage, Fred's killer had felt their pulse quicken at the sound of the back door opening and then closing softly behind Fred. Now, the killer heard the slight rustle of leaves as Fred turned right out of the back kitchen door and began walking towards the open space between the house and the garage, which was set back even farther from the street than the house was. The newspaper lay neatly folded on the far side of the black Ford Explorer that was parked near the top of the driveway. The killer knew Fred would walk between the garage doors and around the front bumper of the vehicle to retrieve the paper, and when Fred did exactly that, the killer would be ready. Now adjusting their blue latex gloves, the killer took a slow, deliberate breath. The killer assumed the children were asleep in the house, but even if they were awake, or if they woke up, and even came down the stairs or looked out the bedroom windows, they wouldn't see anything. The killer would be gone, and Fred's body would be hidden from view by the big black car in the driveway. A moment later, the sound of rustling leaves gave way to the sound of slippers on pavement. But as Fred rounded the front bumper of his Ford Explorer, the garage doors on his left and the children's basketball hoop on the other side of the driveway facing him, he paused for a second before making another quarter turn to his right to scan the ground for the folded newspaper. At that moment, Fred's killer stepped out of their hiding place on the far side of the garage. This shot would not be fired at point-blank range, or even close enough to leave any gunpowder residue on Fred's sweatshirt or robe, but the killer would still hit their target. A moment later, as Fred straightened and began to turn back towards whatever he had just seen out of the corner of his eye, his killer pulled the trigger of the .38 caliber revolver loaded with its copper-jacketed hollow-point bullets. And as the sound of the shots died away, the killer watched as Fred crumpled to the ground. Reaching the pavement, Fred's body rolled so he lay face down but still partly on his side, his glasses landing a foot or so away from his face, his knees drawn up slightly towards his chest. Although neighbors would report hearing 3 gunshots, only 2 bullets hit their mark. The second shot entered the soft tissue of Fred's right arm back to front, the bullet traveling downward and missing any vital tissue. That was the bullet that would be recovered at the crime scene in just a few hours. It was the first shot that proved fatal. That type of bullet, designed to mushroom out upon impact so it did maximum internal damage, had entered from the back, striking Fred in the lower right side before ripping upward through his spleen, kidney, liver, diaphragm, and aorta, the main artery carrying blood away from the heart. By the time the first dogs in the neighborhood had started to bark, the killer was running across the neighbor's front lawn towards the darker shade of the trees that bordered each house lot. The medical examiner, who would later perform the autopsy on Fred's body, could not rule out the possibility that if Fred had been found immediately after that first 911 call at around 6:37 a.m., he might have survived his injuries. Still, the first medics on the scene an hour later had done everything they could. Despite not finding a pulse, they still turned Fred onto his back and cut away his shirt to inject heart-stimulating drugs and to perform CPR, but they were too late. Sometime between that first 911 call and the second 911 call more than an hour later, Fred had died of organ failure and massive internal bleeding. By the time police had covered Fred's body with a white sheet and escorted his terrified children out of the house, Fred's killer was already on the road, making the 2-hour drive south to Virginia's Norfolk International Airport. After returning their rented maroon minivan, Fred's killer made their way to the ticketing agent at Southwest Airlines. At 8:29 a.m., 2 hours after murdering Fred, the killer booked a flight first to Baltimore, 200 miles north, and then on from Baltimore to Houston, Texas. As Piper Roundtree handed the Southwest Airline ticketing agent her sister Tina's ID and the ticket Piper had bought using the credit card that she'd taken from her boyfriend, Jerry Walters, she made a quick adjustment to the blonde wig she was wearing over her dark brown hair, and she also made sure her sunglasses completely covered her brown eyes. A few minutes later, when Piper sat down in the waiting area until it was time to board her 12:30 a.m. flight back to Houston, she pulled out her cell phone and scrolled through the long list of calls she had made since arriving in Richmond 2 days earlier, on Thursday, October 28th. She was smart to have asked the receptionist at the motel in Richmond to change her name in the register from Tina Roundtree to Geraldine Smith, just one more way to throw police off her trail. And when the police did come to question her, she could honestly tell them that things with Fred were so much better now than they had been 2 years ago. But for Piper, her camping vacation earlier in the month with the kids had finally shown her that getting along better with Fred still wasn't enough. The person her children really needed wasn't their father, it was her, their mother. And soon enough, they would have her, and only her. As Piper tucked Tina's driver's license back inside her wallet, Piper looked closely at the small picture of her sister. Tina was a little taller and heavier, her hair was blonde and her eyes were a bright blue, but when Piper wore the wig and dark glasses, all people saw were the similarities in the sisters' faces and expressions and that wide, Roundtree smile. But it would turn out that Piper's disguise, like her alibi, was not quite as good as she thought it was. 5 days after Piper Roundtree killed the father of her 3 kids, Detective Kelly from Virginia knew that in order to solve this murder investigation, he needed to get a positive ID on Southwest Airlines passenger Tina Roundtree. So, on the afternoon of Wednesday, November 3rd, the same day that hundreds of people were attending Fred Jablin's funeral service back in Richmond, the investigator made one more trip back to Hobby Airport in Houston. He tracked down the name of the Southwest airline agent who had checked Tina Roundtree's ticket and luggage on her flight from Houston out to Richmond 1 week earlier on Thursday, October 28th. When he met Kathy Molly, the big detective from Virginia showed her Tina Roundtree's airline ticket and asked Kathy if she could remember anything about the passenger. A moment later, Kathy handed the ticket back with a friendly smile. "Yeah, I remember," she told the investigator. Kathy went on to say that the passenger was a very attractive woman, nicely dressed, but there was something else Kathy remembered too. The passenger was obviously wearing a blonde wig, and along with her suitcase, she was carrying a gun. And when Detective Kelly showed Kathy the pictures he now carried with him everywhere, one of Tina Roundtree and one of Piper Roundtree, Kathy didn't even hesitate before tapping the photo of Piper. "That's her," Kathy said. "That's the woman who checked the gun." On Monday, November 8, 2004, 10 days after Fred was shot to death outside of his home on Hearthglow Lane, Henrico County Police charged his ex-wife, Piper Roundtree, with first-degree murder. Piper was arrested shortly after leaving a custody hearing in Virginia, at which Piper asked the court to grant her, and not Fred's brother Michael, custody of the 3 Roundtree Jablin children. In addition to having been identified as the passenger traveling to and from Richmond under the name Tina Roundtree, Piper's cell phone records had also placed her in and around Richmond from Thursday, October 28th through the morning of Saturday, October 30th, the morning of Fred's death. Even though Piper claimed that she and her sister Tina often used one another's cell phones, the phone that Piper used on Friday evening, the night before Fred was killed, to call her son Paxton and tell him she was in Texas, was the same cell phone that had pinged off cell phone towers in Richmond to connect that call to Paxton's cell phone. As for Piper's alibis, it would turn out that after checking credit card receipts, the man who had placed Piper in the Volcano Bar in Houston on that Friday night before Fred's murder had made a mistake. It had been Saturday night, after Piper had returned from Richmond, that she was seen at that bar. And although Piper's friend and former law colleague would insist to Virginia investigators that he had talked to Piper in Houston midday on Saturday, before that Southwest flight from Baltimore arrived in Houston, it turned out that he had made an earlier statement to a reporter saying that the first time he had seen Piper in nearly a year was the day after Fred's murder, Sunday, October 31st, when she would have already been back in Houston for nearly 24 hours. On Saturday, February 26, 2005, 1 year and 4 months after Fred was murdered, a Virginia jury spent less than 1 hour in deliberations before coming back with a guilty verdict in the trial of Piper Roundtree. Her defense attorney argued, unsuccessfully, that the real murderer was Piper's sister, Tina, and when Piper herself took the stand, she implied the same thing, while at the same time insisting to the end that she herself had absolutely nothing to do with Fred's murder. When asked point blank if she wanted the jury to think her sister Tina committed the murder, Piper replied, "I have no idea what happened." Piper would use that same refrain when she was asked how her cell phone had appeared in Virginia in the days before and on the day of Fred's murder, or why she decided to brush up on her shooting skills the week before Fred's death, or why she had used her boyfriend's credit card to purchase a blonde wig, or how her black Liberty Jeep had wound up in the parking lot at the Hobby Airport in Houston from Thursday, October 28th to Saturday, October 30th, Piper told the jury she either had no idea how those things could have happened, or that they were just meaningless coincidences that had nothing to do with Fred's murder. 2.5 months later, on May 7th, 2005, Piper was sentenced to life in prison. Her first request for parole in 2020 was denied. She will be eligible for parole again in 2033 when she will be 72 years old. On Friday, November 4th, 2005, days before Piper's trial for murder, Piper's sister, Tina, pled guilty in a Houston courtroom to a charge related to Fred Japlin's murder, attempted tampering of evidence. Tina was fined $300 and sentenced to 80 hours of community service. Tina died in 2020. In 2006, a Virginia court granted full custody of Fred and Piper's 3 children to Fred's brother, Michael Jablin. We'd like to say a special thanks to author Catherine Casey, whose book, Die, My Love, a true story of revenge, murder, and 2 Texas sisters, was our main source in creating this podcast. Because Piper Roundtree has never admitted any guilt or involvement in the murder of Fred Jablin, we relied on the prosecution's evidence and theory of motive to create our reconstruction of this crime. If you're interested in finding out more, please see our source list for additional background and information. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, when the 5-star review button comes into your store at the mall, only pretend to validate their parking ticket when they hand it to you. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Amazon Music, because starting November 1st of this year, 2022, our podcast is only going to be available on Amazon Music. However, from now until November 1st, you can still get the podcast on all platforms. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.